know that it's cliche to say this, but I honestly hated the majority of the planning part of our wedding. Now, I loved getting our marriage license, and I loved it when we got our wedding venue. And I loved making the mix of music for our reception. Picking out the tuxes was all right. I mean, it was kind of fun. But everything else was just so overwhelming and tedious. Planning a wedding, it kind of takes away the joy of the actual wedding and the peacefulness of it. That's what I hated the most. But we got through it, and not without a couple of hiccups along the way. At one point, we went to this wedding like vendor event, and it was just full of caterers, photographers, DJs, etc. I mean, the works. It was packed. And Sarah and I got kind of a kick out of a few of the booths. There was a dessert catering booth that had this chocolate fountain, and they were serving strawberries with it. And they were letting people come up and sample it. So Sarah and I definitely had our fair share of of samples. I felt a little weird though wandering that event because I felt like I wasn't going to end up getting a whole lot out of it. The thing that I figured most was we might be able to get a photographer, which we did. And our photographers were incredible. Their style just matched perfectly with ours. They didn't care so much about the perfectly posed photo, although we still ended up doing a few of those because that's what you do. But their main objective was just to capture actual moments. They wanted to capture, authenticity. And I remember looking through their portfolio and just being blown away by how great they were at actually capturing those moments. Sarah and I knew pretty quickly that we wanted them to be our photographers, and we were actually lucky enough to get them. Sarah and I also knew that we did not want a big ceremony. For one, weddings are stupid expensive. It's ridiculous. And two, we felt that the ceremony itself, it was really just for her and I. Obviously we wanted people there, our families and some friends, but we really did not want like this massive audience. It wasn't a show to us. We figured small ceremony, slightly larger reception. So that's exactly what we did. Our wedding parties were going to be pretty small as well. I was going to have my best man and a groomsman, and Sarah was going to have her maid of honor and a bridesmaid. And a couple of our friends were our ushers, and my uncle was kind enough to actually proceed over the wedding. The smaller party definitely helped make the ceremony seem a little more intimate. I ended up asking my brother to be my best man, and I asked Sarah's brother to be my groomsman. Sarah ended up asking her cousin to be her maid of honor and her sister to be her bridesmaid. To me, that pretty much should have done it. I remember thinking how we had all that we needed. We had the people, the date, the photographers, we would have the music in no time, and we had my uncle to preside over the whole thing. Granted, I was just excited about getting married, and I was wishing that I just didn't have to deal with all of the little details that come along with it. As everything does, it all did finally come together, and we had everything in place. We did our rehearsal, which was exactly as one would hope, or went exactly as one would hope, and then we did our rehearsal dinner. I loved that dinner. The food was all right. Actually, truth be told, I don't really even remember the food, but what I do remember is just looking around at that giant table and just feeling so loved. Our families were all in with supporting Sarah and I, and that just meant the world. I had already known that my bachelor party, it wasn't going to be a stereotypical party. I knew that my brother he would just never even consider or even allow the thought of, the bachelor party stereotypes to even enter his mind. And I was definitely okay with that. I told him flat out that all I really wanted to do was just hang out, maybe go drive some go-karts, do some putt-putt, and, maybe cause a little mayhem with those things. And I definitely wanted to go to a movie with the guys, especially with my brother, because seeing movies with him and my friends, it's just always been one of the most meaningful things to me. I always believed, and I still do to this day, that movies played just a vital role in my relationship with my brother and helped us bring us together, especially in those younger days. To me, going to the movies with my brother and my guys, I mean, that's a tradition that needed to continue, because I felt that once I was married, that tradition was, it might change or just end. And that's a fear that kind of came true. There was no alcohol, there was no strippers, no drugs, nothing during my bachelor party. But I promise that we had more fun and we laughed harder during that day than the ones that are only focused on getting fucked up and acting like marriage is a death or a burden. We went to this place in Denver called Boondocks. It's a smaller little amusement event area thing. Um, it's got like go-karts and laser tag, and it's got an arcade, restaurant. You got to put restaurant in the quotes. Mini golf, whatever. And we showed up with the goal of just enjoying ourselves there and just seeing how long it would take for us to get kicked out. Spoiler, we did not get kicked out. Now, being a bunch of young males who grew up watching the greatest golf movie of all time that predominantly features putting, we all knew that we had to tap into our inner Happy Gilmore, while we're on the putt-putt course. So we were loud. We cussed all of those balls out. We used slap shots, and we definitely shot a few balls into the parking lot, especially my good friend Casey. Casey he's always had many talents, but one of his greatest is his ability to tap into fun, and his confidence in it is just infectious. When he gets on a roll with making sure that those around him, and himself included, can't help but laugh, you just want to join in. That dude is responsible for some of the hardest laughter that I've ever had. And some of it came from that day. We paced ourselves, figuring that if we were going to get kicked out, we should at least get our money's worth first. Casey made sure to really push that line, though. And my personal favorite moment, it came during the go-karts. The main rule with the go-karts, is no bumping. They don't want you turning it into bumper cars. But if you do it right, if you make it look like accidental bumping, they typically don't notice or care. Well, Casey somehow managed to turn his go-kart completely around and drive in the wrong direction during the race. And to just add hilarity to the image of this dude who is well over 6 feet tall, squished in this go-kart, driving the wrong way, he spent the drive screaming and trying to avoid the workers that were chasing him down. It was amazing. The end of our time at Boondocks, it came and we finished it with laser tag. Now, I didn't see this happen, but it was a moment that made us all decide that this was probably a good ending note for Boondocks. So during laser tag, Casey got just a little bit too into the game, and he ended up pinning this young kid down and just shooting him with the laser gun. It's dick move, but it was hilarious to hear about. So we left Boondocks and we headed to the theater back in our hometown. The movie was pretty lackluster, but it was the third movie in the X-Men franchise, and I remember it being the only movie that everyone was up for seeing. We all knew that it was going to be action-packed and entertaining, and it probably wouldn't require any real emotions. It was there to entertain, and even though we all felt that movie wasn't the best, it was still enjoyable. And plus, man, I always love seeing movies with my guys. And the night before the big day, it arrived, and Sarah and I did the traditional thing of the bride and the groom. They don't see each other until the ceremony. Us guys stayed at my parents' place, and the ladies went and stayed at Sarah's. Us guys watched Wedding Crashers, and then my dad, he took us all outside for one of the greatest moments of my life. My dad, he bought us all cigars. The real ones, not those shitty gas station wannabe ones. And he taught us how to actually cut them and light them. One by one, my dad helped us all through it. And when it came my turn, it took a lot for me to not break into tears as my dad lit my cigar for me, and us guys just enjoyed that moment together. I can't speak for the others, but for me, while we stood outside smoking the cigars, talking and laughing together, I felt like I made my family and my friends proud. Truly proud. Because they had all seen how far I had come. But what meant the most was feeling like I had made my father and my brother proud of me. It didn't require a false version of me, and it didn't require me acting out in misguided fear. It hadn't required anything more than just growth. I loved that night, and it was one of the most meaningful nights of my life. Now, if you've been married or have been in a wedding before, then you know that something always has to happen the night before or the day of. And just when everyone is feeling like you've made it to the finish line with only a few minor hiccups along the way, something kind of big just seems to have to happen and panic mode is initiated. So we got up the next morning and my adrenaline was pumping. I was stoked. The day was here, and in just a few hours, I was going to be married. We all got dressed, we gave hugs, and my guys all made sure that I was okay and ready. That morning, my brother, he took me outside for just a quick chat. He had been married already, and he wanted to give me some peace and some advice. Both marriage-wise and, some brotherly guidance. I remember some of the marriage advice, but what I really remember from our little chat was him hugging me and telling me that I was awesome and that he loved me. We went back inside and we finished getting ready. Once we were all suited up, it was time to head to that venue. And Sarah and I, we had chosen the spot that felt the most connected to us. When we were figuring out the spot to get married, we wanted it to be a special place. There was really only one place that met our criteria, and we had managed to get it. Actually, booking the place was kind of what picked out our wedding date for us because the spot was only available on that day. So we were getting married at V. Steen Smith Park. And the spot we were getting married on was close to the spot that I had actually proposed at. We couldn't get the actual spot because where I proposed wasn't necessarily a dedicated event spot. But where we did get married was pretty close to it. I was so excited to just see all the chairs, the runner for the wedding party to walk on, and that gazebo that Sarah and I had picked out. And the drive to the park, I mean, it's about 20 minutes from my parents' place, but the drive felt forever. I could feel the tingles of anticipation just kicking in, much like when you're waiting for a concert to start or a movie that you've been waiting a long time to go see. I wasn't nervous about the wedding. I wasn't really nervous at all, but I was excited. And the reality of the whole day was just kicking in hard. So we parked and we all got out, sucking in that just awesome mountain air and the sounds of the river flowing through the canyon. And we started walking to our spot with just the big smiles that quickly vanished. Nothing was set up. The party rental place that we had used was late. And to top it off, the guy had actually forgotten his tools to even put the gazebo together. He got back in his truck and he drove back to his shop, which was close to about 45 minutes without traffic. With traffic, it's closer to about an hour. And the wedding was in less than 2 hours. My brother, my soon-to-be brother-in-law, our ushers, Casey, and my uncle and myself, we were just left dumbfounded by the rental place. I felt the urge to call Sarah and tell her, but my brother and my uncle both told me not to. It was going to be handled, and not a word of it was to be spoken about until well after the ceremony. As far as my guys were concerned, Sarah and everyone else would just never be able to tell that something had gone wrong. So they took their jackets off, and I started to join before being stopped by my brother. You aren't allowed to touch anything. You just stand there and don't get your tux dirty. I felt bad because I wasn't allowed to help, but my brother had a point. I was in an all-white tux. I couldn't afford to get it all sweaty and dirty. My uncle took me aside while the guys were setting everything up. And he prayed over me, and he prayed over the wedding itself. And then he and I just had a moment where he let me know just how proud he and the whole family were and how excited they all were that I had not only found love, but I had worked so hard to better my life. I remember him patting me on the shoulder, and he told me to remember that the day wasn't for anyone else. It was for Sarah and I. And I needed to remember to just focus on her and only her. My dudes got it all set up, minus the completed gazebo, but they were able to assemble a little bit, and it still looked pretty good. And it was just in time, too, because within minutes of them finishing, the guests began to arrive. Our ushers, John and Ben, they took their spots and they escorted the guests to their seats. And my brothers had gone off to their spots with Sarah's ladies, and they waited for their cues. My uncle and I, we stood to the side until our cue came, to take our spots at the front. Casey was in charge of the music, and he had this small little stereo with him that played the mix that I had made. And then the rental guy showed up with his tools, and we all promptly told him that it was far too late and that he had to get out of there. Our cue came, and I took my spot at the front. And I watched Sarah's brother walk down the aisle with his sister towards me. And all we could do was smile. I watched my brother walk towards me, next to Sarah's maid of honor. And I could just feel the tears starting to well. I had told myself that when it came time for Sarah to walk down the aisle, I would keep my eyes down and I wouldn't look at her until she was actually walking down the aisle. I caught a glimpse of her, though, and her father that walking towards all the guests as I put my head down, and I felt that first tear go free. My brother, he gripped my shoulder, and I looked up. It's not just a gimmick used in movies, folks. When I looked up at Sarah and I locked eyes with her, everything just ceased to exist. I couldn't hear the music. I couldn't hear the river. I couldn't see all the guests that were in front of me. All I saw was her. And all I could do was smile and cry. I didn't snap out of it until Sarah's dad answered the question that starts every wedding ceremony. Who gives this woman's hand in marriage? On behalf of her mother and I do, Sarah's dad proclaimed. I never asked him, but I also felt that his volume had just gone up due to the fact that he was trying to fight back his own tears. He took his seat and the ceremony began. I can't tell you what all my uncle said to the guests. I can't remember because I was doing exactly what he had told me to do. All of my focus was on Sarah. I couldn't unlock my eyes from her. I know we did our vows. Not the ones that we had written for each other. I'm not actually sure what happened, but we ended up just doing the standard wedding vows. To this day, I don't believe that we ever got around to sharing our written vows to one another. I know we had talked about saving them for an anniversary, but it just never happened. I know we did the rings, and obviously I remember kissing her and squeezing her tightly against me as we kissed, but the words that were spoken, they just aren't there because they weren't what I was focused on. I didn't even notice the yellow butterfly that just stayed with Sarah and I during the whole ceremony. It flew away, I guess, shortly after we kissed. We were introduced as husband and wife, and we made our way to the little cabin by the pond where we waited for our photographers and the wedding parties. We took pictures for a little while afterwards, and then it was time to head to the reception, which was a little bit of a drive. Sarah's mom had volunteered to drive us to the reception, and I remember being in the back of her car with Sarah, just absolutely elated and also feeling just a little off because I wanted to make out with my wife, but I did not want to do it in front of her mom. So we kind of treated it like any other time that we had been passengers on the drive through that canyon. We just all chatted until we got to the spot where the reception was being held and all the guests were. Everyone had already taken their seats and was waiting for us to arrive so that the food could be served and the speeches could be made. We were introduced as Mr. and Mrs. Weishar, and we took our seats. I remember the speeches just being fantastic and funny, and I know that I made a quick speech thanking everyone and telling everyone how much they meant to Sarah and I, and how it was a day and a journey that we would never forget. Dinner was finished, and it was time to cut loose and dance. Again, my focus turned solely to Sarah. I don't even remember what song we danced to, But I was in awe that this beauty had chosen me to spend her life with. And I was thinking about just how a couple of years prior to that moment, I had been completely consumed with hatred, anger, drinking, smoking weed, and just absolute pessimism. And now I was happy, sober, in love, and married. Sarah kissed me as it came towards the end of the song, and that's when we invited everyone to the dance floor. I danced with Sarah's mom, and I danced with my mom. And I remember looking at my mom and reassuring her that her youngest son was all grown up now. I hadn't just meant it as, like, I'm an adult. I meant it as, look how far I've come. My mom hugged me, and she told me that she was proud of me and was just so happy for me. We signed our license, we cut the cake, and then my brother took us aside and explained to us that it was time to go. I remember we were both like, nah, we still have the rest of the party to enjoy. But my brother shook his head, and he told us that the party didn't matter. It was time for us to go and start our lives as a married couple. And it reminded us that the day was not about the guests, it was about us. He gathered everyone to send us off, and we drove away in our decorated, just married car. And that was the last time that we saw those decorations. And everyone all fancied up. We got to our hotel, and we headed to our room. We took a little bit just to kind of soak in the day because the drive to the hotel and being in the room for the first time was that was the first time that whole day that we were alone. I was still in awe that we had done it. We had gotten married. And as we unpacked and we got ourselves ready for the rest of the night, I realized something important. Now, everyone I have come to learn has a different opinion on this. And that's cool. That's cool. We shared the opinion that we had already taken a massive step by getting married. We did not need to take another massive step by getting pregnant on our wedding night. But of all the things to forget, yeah, we forgot to get condoms. I didn't bother getting out of my tux. I told Sarah that I would be right back, and I headed to the store. I ran inside, straight to the aisle with the condoms, grabbed a box, and headed to the register. I had no shame. I made eye contact with all the people that were next to me as I made my purchase. They knew what was up, and if they had a problem with it, they would get over it. So I hurried back, and my brother was correct. We definitely had more important things to do than to keep dancing with a bunch of people. For the most part, the first few months of our marriage were fairly uneventful. We found this small one-bedroom apartment that I just absolutely loved. It represented the start of our own lives, and it was the first place that we called our own. And I genuinely enjoyed the size of it. I liked how small it was because it was just Sarah and I felt cozy in that place. I got a job with a friend at a pretty famous bulk goods store, and the job itself wasn't great, but it was better than nothing, and I could move positions over time. So I started out in the lot as a cart guy, and which at first I thought was just the easiest thing in the world. Of course, by the time I would get home at night and have to walk up a flight of stairs to get home, my legs would just be so sore and sometimes completely locked up that I would even struggle to make it to the front door. Life was fairly simple for us in those first few months. We worked, we had plenty of date nights, we hung out with our families, and we had dinner at our friend's house about once a week or so. The the ones from the car crash story, the ones with the baby. Our friendship with those two, they just grew and grew. And they became kind of our most trusted and closest friends. And we talked all the time. And I worked with the husband, so we regularly chatted at work as well. Things felt great. Life was decent. And then something familiar made a reappearance. I started feeling that old dread of depression, reminding me that it was still around. I had been riding that positive high for a few years at that point, and I think I made a major error. I had assumed that I had magically been cured. And to feel that darkness creeping around again, it scared the hell out of me, and I reacted without even thinking. I just immediately started shutting down and began working on building up those walls again. I was ashamed and scared all over again, but this time, those feelings, they felt worse than before. I felt like I was completely letting Sarah down because I had told her that she had made my life better and that those dark days were long gone. And out of my fear of making Sarah potentially feel bad or making her think that I lied to her, I decided to put my fake smile back on. And I told myself internally I would just have to deal with it on my own and everything would be okay. Of course, that would prove to be one of the worst mistakes I would ever make. And the more I worked at keeping the darkness in my mind a secret, the angrier and the more hopeless I felt. I wonder if anyone else out there, and I'm sure there's plenty of people that can look back on their lives and pinpoint the moments that started a bad spiral. Most people tend to look back on their lives and try to pinpoint a positive moment, which is great. And I can and I do that as well. But I wonder if others have ever looked back and pinpointed a moment or two that set the stage for some bad times. I can. And there isn't a day that goes by that I don't wish that I could go back to that specific moment and stop myself. It will haunt me forever. We were at dinner with a group of our friends one night, and it was just like every other dinner night. We all showed up early to chat and hang out while the food cooked. And then we all sat around the table, just talking and eating. There was nothing new, there was nothing special about that night. I was working pretty hard at making sure that no one could tell that I was just in my head, building my walls and trying to hold the darkness back. I was doing a decent job at it too. I mean, if anyone had noticed anything about me, it only would have been Sarah. If she did notice anything, she wasn't going to ask me about it because she hated confrontation and she probably just didn't want to start an argument with me about it. Every part of me wants to argue that if she had talked to me about it, I would have listened with an open mind. But the truth is, I would have been very defensive about it. I wouldn't have been able to talk about it without feeling attacked because I was already on the defensive with myself. Drinking was brought up a couple of times, and we laughed about the high school days and the times that we drank. And I remember the night winding down. And as we gathered like our plates and helped clear the table, my friend just casually let us know that he happened to have a bottle of whiskey. And he asked if anyone wanted to do a shot. Sarah immediately said no, and I was a little hesitant about it. Our friends were all doing a shot, and I could feel a pull inside of me to join them. Sarah looked at me, and she told me that she did not care if I had a shot. It was going to be up to me. Now, whether she was being genuine or if she was testing me, I've never found out. She probably doesn't even remember that night. But as soon as I accepted the offer, I felt horrible. But I did what I did best, and I just bottled that guilt and I stuffed it down with the darkness inside me. When I watched my friend pour my shot, I picked it up and just studied that amber liquid. I could feel all of the good parts of me just screaming in my head. My intuition was just aching, and everything inside of me told me to just put the shot down and call it a night. And instead, we all said a quick cheers, and I tipped that shot glass into my mouth, and I just let that whiskey flow through me. I instantly knew I had made a mistake. Everyone put their empty shot glasses down and everyone headed out. All I could taste for the rest of the night was that burn in my throat. And all I kept thinking was, what have I done? Sarah had given me permission. It had sounded very genuine. But I remember seeing just the tiniest hint that as I did the shot, she also felt disappointed. I don't know for sure. Maybe I was just projecting my own guilt and shame and saw a glimmer of it in her eyes and face. Whatever the case was, I could tell that me doing that shot had not been a good thing. It took me several years to be open enough to look back and recognize that moment as the catalyst for things to come. Several things went wrong after that. And to this day, I still have to work through the emotions that spawned from that moment. I've been told by countless people that I can't blame myself for everything that went wrong in those days. I wasn't the only one at fault. That's true. Plenty of us made incredibly bad decisions, and a few of us paid just a little more than others for those decisions. But the truth is that had I opted out of doing that shot, I wouldn't have opened that door again. I wouldn't have sat in the car on the drive home recognizing that the warmth from that whiskey had helped to take my mind off of the darkness. It instantly made me want more. Had I turned that shot down, maybe I would have broke down and just talked to Sarah about what was going inside my mind. Obviously, I'll never know what kind of events would have happened had I not taken that shot, but my intuition tells me that things would have been much different. Some might say, but you got drunk in Scotland. What was so different about that than doing one shot? And my answer is my mental state. When I got drunk in Scotland, I was in a healthy mental state, and I was able to make the decision to excessively drink just that one night. I didn't feel any pull, nor did I feel my intuition screaming at me. I was in a good place. And when I took that shot, I had already started to revert back to the mental state that I had before meeting Sarah. But because I felt so shameful about even having that darkness back, things just felt heavier on me. And when I took that shot, that whiskey added a hint of numbness to that weight, and it teased the ability to numb my guilt and my shame. Life went on for as usual, for a couple of weeks after that. And I found myself kind of happy that the couple of dinner nights following that night had just been normal nights. And then while at work, my friends started talking to me about having an actual party. Not a dinner party, but a real party. I told him that I wasn't sure that Sarah would be up for it, to which his reply was that his wife was already talking to Sarah about it. I remember telling him that it really depended on Sarah. I was basically trying to say no without saying no, and I was hoping to use Sarah as my excuse. So we talked about it for a short time, and then Sarah and I talked about it. And to this day, I have no clue why Sarah changed her mind. I can't tell you what was going on in her head during all of this, or really ever. I don't remember her putting up much of an argument. And before I even had a grasp on anything, we had agreed to attending and participating in the actual party. I'm sure that if I asked Sarah now what made her agree to the partying, she probably wouldn't be able to tell me. She's probably forgotten all about it. Or she'd tell me something along the lines of she figured I just needed to get it out of my system. And because we didn't really talk about problems or confront them, it was the only way that she could think of that might help me. I don't know. Regardless, though, we showed up to that first party and the drinking commenced. I feel like that's a good spot to take a beat and let myself breathe. I've never had an opportunity to just get everything without someone interrupting to interject words of advice or start spinning everything to be a joke, whatever. Like, I've never been able to just get everything out. Most of the time, with the exception of when I was in therapy, when I've started talking about the deeper parts of these moments with people, I basically have to sum it up and shortchange myself. Whether it's someone's attention span just isn't there, or it starts to get a little too real for them, or what I figure is the actual reason, they just don't care. I have learned that people have really enjoyed hearing about all the party stories that I have, and what follows is a long line of them. At least as long of a list as I can remember. Some of them are definitely entertaining, and the amounts that I consumed tend to be a little shocking to people. I had a good time. For the most part. When I was partying in those days. But what pretty much everyone was completely oblivious to was everything outside of the drunken shenanigans. It's sad to say, but I'm pretty positive that I was best at fooling everyone when I was drunk. I was even pretty good at fooling myself. Well, as you can probably guess, I don't remember that first party all that well. I remember it taking me no time at all to just do several shots and drink several beers. And I remember the group of us that were there just being drunk buffoons. I didn't think about my mental health the whole night. At least I assume I didn't think about it the whole night because I know that I didn't before everything went blank. I do remember finding it weird but exciting to be partying with Sarah. But by the time that I made that observation, the first couple of shots had already been done. And after that, I just didn't think too much about it. For the first handful of parties that we attended, nothing exciting happened. We showed up, and the wives and the girlfriends of whoever was attending, they would all gather while us guys would gather and start cracking open beer. All of us would do the usual small talk for a short time before one of us would announce that it was time to do shots. We would gather in the basement where the living room was, and our friends had this like small coffee table in the middle of the room. And that table typically was called home by all the liquor. There was always vodka, always rum, always whiskey. And the vodka and the rum were always the favorites. We may have had those few kinds of liquor, but we always had several bottles of each kind. Plus whatever beer that we had all brought. Looking back on that early party days, or those early party days with Sarah and our friends, I gotta be honest, incredibly uneventful for the most part. I don't remember what month it was. I do remember there being snow on the ground. Living in Colorado, though, that doesn't exactly help narrow down the month. We were over at our friend's place again, partying and enjoying ourselves. And the night was going like all the other times. The difference being there were a couple other people there that night. And a few of us went outside in the backyard just to enjoy the crisp night air. And those that smoked, they wanted to get their nicotine. I was outside not to smoke, but to just get outside for a little bit. It was around this time, after partying for so long, or for a little while, that I was starting to get a little bored with the partying routine. So I hadn't drunk as much as I typically would on those nights. I still drank a bunch, but I had scaled it back a little bit that night. Everyone else had treated the night like we had done so many times before. They were plastered. I finished my beer outside, and I wanted to go and get another one. And I figured since I was going to have to go inside to get a beer, I would just stay in there. I didn't smoke and was just getting bored all around. And over the course of those early party nights, I had noticed that, man, I was getting bored with several things in my life. I was getting increasingly pretentious about the movies that I watched, like to the point where I was losing the ability to just enjoy a movie as a piece of entertainment. If it wasn't some artsy indie film then I felt like it was mindless. I was bored with reading, which is kind of a big deal for me. Being bored with movies and with books should have been a huge red flag for those around me. It definitely was for me, but I just kept stuffing everything down. And the more I stuffed things down and tried to ignore them, telling myself that I would just figure it out later, the more bored and disconnected to the world I felt. So I walked back to the back door, which had this large window in it. And the door led directly to the stairs that led down into the basement with the living room. And the kitchen area was just to the left of that door. So I walked up to the door, I reached for the handle and looked up through the window in the door and just froze. On the stairs was Sarah and my friend kissing. I turned my eyes up just a little bit and I saw his wife at the bottom of the stairs looking up. My mind went blank. And I had the sudden realization that there was a remarkably high chance that I was actually going to kill someone that night. I punched the door, I turned, and I stormed away. The guys outside were all confused, asking what happened, and I shouted back at them as I walked out of the yard that Sarah and my friend were just making out on the stairs. I had to get away. I made it all the way down the street when the guys that I was outside with, they caught up to me. And my friend was running up to me and trying to talk to me too. I just kept telling everyone over and over to just leave me alone. I told that friend to get the fuck away from me. I remember shouting at him once and then just explaining to him that he needed to keep his distance because I was doing everything that I could to just not lash out and kill him. I think everyone understood because he backed off a bit. His tone calmed down and everyone just stepped in between us. Everyone took a moment talking calmly to me and telling me that I needed to get back to the house where the situation could be taken care of. But it was the middle of the night. We were all drunk and underage. We didn't need the cops showing up and disturbing the whole neighborhood. So we got back to the house, and the vibe at the party had completely changed. It was awkward and just full of anger. And the four of us, we went into the living room and we addressed the situation, while everyone else at the party tried to just ignore it or be mediators. All I wanted to do was hurt him. I wanted to choke the life out of him. I felt completely broken and I was pissed. I couldn't even look at Sarah, which meant that I couldn't really talk to her about it. All I told her was that we would talk about it the next day. Had I not been drinking that night, I would have gotten in the car and just driven away. I wanted to that night, but everyone told me that I had to be rational and not get behind the wheel. Everyone finally calmed down after a while, and I told Sarah that as soon as I woke up the next day, I would be waking her up and we would be out. One of our other friends that was at the party, he asked if he could get a ride with us the next morning because he really didn't want to stick around. And I agreed, and eventually everyone went to sleep. I didn't sleep. I stayed up just replaying that image in my head and thinking about what I was going to say to Sarah. I thought about our entire relationship. I thought about our wedding and the vows that we had made to one another. I concentrated on the feeling of betrayal, and I built up a bit more of those walls in my head. Early the next day, or next morning, I got up and I woke Sarah and our friend up. I told our friend that if he still wanted to ride, he needed to get up because we were leaving. And I just told Sarah to wake up. We left. In the drive to our friend's house, I just spent chatting with him. We talked about music, and I was doing everything that I could to not make the car ride awkward for him. Although I'm pretty positive that I made it worse because I was obviously trying to avoid the whole situation. We dropped him off and we headed home. It was time for us to discuss things. Sarah told me that she had been lying on the stairs because she was so drunk. She had been laying there for a little bit when the kissing started, and she told me that she had thought it was me. She hadn't realized it wasn't until after she heard the bang on the door and the crash from his wife flipping their foosball table. She hadn't come after me because she had stayed on the stairs in disbelief that the whole thing had happened. I told her that we needed to not talk to those two for some time and that she especially needed to not talk to him. So we got home and I realized that I wouldn't be able to sleep in the same bed as her. I told her that I was going to sleep on the couch for the time being and just figure out what would come next. She asked me how long I thought I would be sleeping on the couch, and I told her I didn't know. Nothing was said out loud about it, but we were on the same page. I was going to spend my time on the couch thinking about whether to leave her or not. And she knew that I was going to be thinking about that. Our days following that were just like two roommates who just never interacted. And my next shift at work, it was a couple days after that. And I knew that I was going to be seeing him. And I knew that he was going to want to talk to me. I had to focus on what I was going to say to him. And I had to focus all of my energy into just not beating him down. I still really wanted to hurt him. But I absolutely didn't want anyone to know that anything had happened. I didn't want anyone asking questions, and I didn't want anyone to think differently of Sarah. I was also just trying to stuff the whole thing away and hide it with all of the other shit that I didn't want to talk to anyone about. It took less than 20 minutes after I showed up for my shift that he came up to me. As soon as he got within earshot of me, I just told him straight up I had nothing to say to him and I didn't care about anything he had to say to me. He ignored me and he started to try to talk to me. I told him it didn't matter. I didn't care. And that he needed to just leave me alone and let me do my job, which he reluctantly did. I wish I remembered exactly how long I slept on the couch. But I knew the first night that I wasn't going to leave Sarah. I stayed on the couch because I blamed myself for the whole thing, and I was angry. It was definitely close to a month before we actually spoke to each other. I didn't really sleep the whole time that I was on the couch, and I didn't say a word of anything to anyone about any of it. Sarah and I went through the motions when we were with our friends or families, to keep up appearances. But once we were in the car, the motions ended and we would just drive home in silence. One night, I was lying on my back just staring at the ceiling in the dark. And as Sarah slept, I confessed to myself that I missed my wife. And that was that. The next day, I put my pillow back on the bed, and when Sarah asked me what I was doing, I told her that I missed her and that I wanted us to get back on track and be us again. I told her that I had vowed to love her and stay with her through the good and the bad, and I meant it. We made amends, and I felt a bit better. Of course, the depression that I was trying to hide and the anger that I felt had been molding together. And shortly after Sarah and I made up, I slipped into this mentality of negativity that would just last for a very long time. And just when you thought, surely the partying would come to an end after that, anyone with common sense would be able to look at all of this and say, should probably step away from the drinking. We pretty much picked up right where we left off. The only difference was that when we started partying again, I was no longer drinking for enjoyment. I had officially started drinking to numb my feelings and help me forget about the dark days. I knew that I was giving into my depression. It was a familiar face that I had known all too well when I was younger, and with that familiarity, I followed the same pattern that I had before. I suppressed it. I hid it away from everyone around me. I knew what was happening. I recognized it and kept it a secret. I didn't want to face the reality of having to admit that something was wrong with me. I felt that if I did, I would be dismissed and people around me would only blame the alcohol. I made mass assumptions about how people would react if I spoke up. And I felt at that particular point in time that if I tried to get mental help, I would be mocked and judged. So I turned to what I knew, knowing that the results wouldn't be good. I suppressed my feelings and I turned to alcohol to help get me through the days. Many people, myself included, we tend to joke about or talk about drinking to get over the day. Tough days at work and tough days in life tend to lead to it. Back then, I could feel the danger of dependency just creeping in. But like everything else that was bothering me in those days, I ignored it and I stuffed it down and away. If you've ever been in that kind of situation where you can feel dependency coming on, you know how sneaky and how unsuspecting it can be. There is no night and day switch. I kind of view dependency on alcohol, at least mine, like a Komodo dragon. When the Komodo dragon is hunting large prey, it'll bite it and it'll harm it, and then it'll stalk it. The damage has already been done, and all the Komodo has to really do at that point is just wait. The bacteria that's in its saliva, it makes its way through the prey's system, and it'll weaken it and eventually drop the prey, which allows the Komodo to just come in and finish it off, consuming its meal. I was the prey. Dependency was my Komodo dragon, and the alcohol was the bacteria. Once I started drinking as a coping mechanism, all that Komodo had to do was be patient and let me wear myself out. By the time that I was 21, my alcohol consumption was borderlining into very dangerous territories. I had gone from just drinking a bunch of beer and doing dozens of shots, of various liquors until I passed out, to drinking a bottle of rum just to myself on top of doing all those same shots and drinking all the same amount of beer. Sarah had found a larger apartment for us during this time, and it was the same complex, but it was a different building, and it was a 2-bedroom instead of a single bedroom. She had said that she just thought a new place would be nice, and she was right. I've had moments since where I've wondered if the little move had been in an attempt to get me to slow down on the drinking. Maybe she had made that decision and was hoping that the subtlety of just getting me out of that first apartment would help. Sometimes you hear stories like that where an unseemly change ends up having just this profound impact. Unfortunately, I didn't slow down. Instead, I just ramped up my consumption. The night of my 21st birthday, it's one of my favorite ironies. I had told Sarah and my friends that all I actually wanted to do was have a beer with my dad. That was what meant the most to me about that birthday. To me, having a beer with my dad was the next great moment for him and I to share. We had shared my 13th birthday. We had shared that cigar the night before I got married. This was just the next obvious thing. But it wasn't just that for me. I needed to see the look in my dad's eyes where I knew that my future was going to be okay. I needed, excuse me, I needed that comfort from my dad because by the time my birthday rolled around, thoughts of suicide had kind of started to reintroduce themselves in my mind. I got that beer with my dad. And I am happy to say that it was comforting. There's something about my dad where the times that I have been at my lowest and I happen to be around him, I feel safe. No words need to be said. Nothing grand has to happen. I just know I'm safe. And that was really what I needed on that birthday. And I felt great after having my beer with my dad. It may have been the environment, the company, or the beer itself. It was an oatmeal stout. But that beer tasted way different on every possible level. And looking back on it, it was the first time that I drank a beer just to actually enjoy it. The thoughts of drinking to go numb, to quiet the voices that were in my head, to get as drunk as possible, whatever, they just simply didn't exist with that beer. I was given a look into the healthier and the better part of enjoying a beer, and it was great. And that was the only drink that I had on my birthday. It had kind of been the only drink that I actually needed that day. And I felt good about that. We were all out to dinner, and when I asked what crazy drink I was going to have, a shot or a beer, I just got a soda and said that I was all right. It was strange to everyone, I'm sure, but everyone else, I mean, who were allowed to, they got their drinks. And the ironic part of that birthday is that I was sober and I was okay with it. My best friend had moved back from Seattle, and Sarah's ex-boyfriend before me, he had come into our lives and had just kind of instantly become a part of the little group that we were starting to form. And eventually it would always be us three. And then it turned into a whole thing. Excuse me. It wasn't long after that night that a few of my friends decided that I needed a real night out. They told me that I had no choice. They wanted me to go hit up a few bars with them and to have a good night. A proper 21st. The plan was made that John and I would pregame at one of our favorite local spots. And while we waited for our other friend, I can't remember if he was working or had previous plans. It doesn't matter. So John and I got ourselves a pool table, a little bit of food, and a pitcher of beer. And a little bit of time and a few pitchers of beer later, we set out to meet our friend at a Mexican restaurant for margaritas. The place was well known for having very potent margaritas. 3 and you were cut off. A couple of a couple of margaritas later, we set out into the night to hit up a handful of bars. I only remember going to a couple of bars and doing tons of shots and drinking tons of beer. But I don't remember the remainder of that night. I do remember waking up the next day at home on Sarah's side of the bed, completely naked. According to Sarah and John, I had puked at the last bar of the night, and Sarah had been called to come and get us. Sarah is 5'2". John is right around 6 feet. And they had to carry my drunk ass out of the bar and into the car. According to them, when we got home, I had to puke some more. And while in the bathroom, I proceeded to tell Sarah to check on Sarah. I stripped and I puked. And I only made it to her side of the bed before completely passing out. We laughed about that night for a good while after that. And after that night, I ramped up the drinking like I just had never done before. My tolerance grew to dangerous levels, which meant that my consumption increased as well. We didn't just drink a lot at a time, we drank a lot often. Every other week on payday, we would have a group of us that grew from just a few to like 6 to about 10 people. And we would bar hop in Old Town Fort Collins, hitting up almost every bar. We would avoid the ones that were more focused on being clubs than just bars. We couldn't care less about dancing. We set out to get fucked up and to have a good time. If we weren't bar hopping, we were partying at John's apartment, which also just happened to be just down the sidewalk from our apartment. He had moved into the same complex, just a different building. And on the nights that we didn't party, if Sarah and I weren't having a night to ourselves, which became less frequent as my drinking increased, John and I would still relax with beer and a handful of shots. I remember one night, he and I decided to have just a couple of games of beer pong and just maybe play video games. And we ended up just putting down a case of beer and a bottle of rum between the two of us. We weren't even trying to drink, and it happened within just a couple hours. The amount of alcohol that we consumed, it developed a reputation, especially on the nights that we would hit the bars. When we called our friends, they all knew that the night was going to be long and that the next day or two would be kind of rough. But it was going to be a lot of fun. Some people that I worked with would come out with us just to be a witness to the kind of drinking that we did. One guy came out completely doubting that we could drink nearly as much as he had been told. The next day at work, he was singing a different tune. He told everyone about how he hadn't believed anyone could drink the amounts that we did, and then he watched us all do it. It gave us a good laugh, but when I think about it, I can't help but wonder if he was actually afraid for us during that night. Our bar hopping nights, they always started out the same. We always met up at a Scottish bar that was called the Stonehouse. The Stonehouse featured a drink that you could only get there. It was called a scom. Most people know about the drink, the Irish Car Bomb, which is Jameson, Bailey's, and a half pint of Guinness. You drop your shot of Jameson and Bailey's into the Guinness and you chug it. You have to drink it really fast because the Baileys will curdle. Well, the scom was kind of like that, but so much more potent. It was a full shot of scotch, a shot of scotch and Bailey's, and a full pint of Guinness. You did the scotch, you chugged half the Guinness, and then you dropped the scotch and Bailey's into the remaining Guinness, and you chugged all of that as well. You were allowed 2 of those drinks, and if you did it, you got your picture taken and put up on a wall, and you were cut off from drinking. The nights always started with one of those, a couple of normal shots, and a beer or 2. And then we would proceed into the night. We would start our nights right around 8 or 9, and we would end them after the bars were closing, typically around 2 or 3. At every bar we went into, we would do several shots, drink just shitloads of beer, and maybe drink a few handful of specialty drinks. And if we managed to, we would go back to the Stone House to complete the night with our second scum. Our group had a reputation in the bars. We never caused trouble, and we always set out to get hammered and have a good time. And we achieved it. It got to a point where we had our own bartenders at one of the bars, and at one of the bars, we ended up getting our own shot. It was several different types of vodka, and I'm pretty positive it was Monster Energy drink as well, which made it look just bright green. Those nights started off as a ton of fun. Sarah never joined. She had always hated crowds. And I always wanted her to come with us, though. As much fun, or as drunk as I would get, I always wished that she would have come out with all of us. She would join us for the occasional party at John's, but only if it was going to be a smaller gathering. Like I said, she hates crowds. And I was ramping up my drinking while she was burning out on it. We had several nights with stupid drunken antics, such as accidentally mooning Old Town Square because I wanted to jump onto the fountain that was in the middle of the square. I missed the statue, and I fell into the water the first time, and when I pulled myself up, my shorts stayed down. Normal people would have been embarrassed and walked off, hoping to forget that it ever happened. I pulled my shorts up, I got a little extra running room, and tried the jump again. I made it the second time, but once again, my soaking wet shorts attempted to stay down when I pulled myself up onto the statue. One of the nights that John and I were just hanging out, we ended up with a shopping cart from one of the stores that was at the mall. The mall was across the street from our apartment complex. And for some reason, to this day, completely unknown to me, I decided to bring the cart into the apartment. And it stayed in the apartment for about a week before we got drunk again and took it back. I also got a concussion one night because I was too drunk to lift John off of the ground. We were hammered. And on this night, we had really put the drinks down. We were walking to my building, which had like this little courtyard area in front of it. John had fallen down on the ground near the front step of the building's door. I grabbed his hand and to help lift him off the ground, but when I pulled, I lost my grip. And the momentum, it threw me backwards into the grass where the back of my head found the electrical box that was sitting near the edge of the grass. I instantly felt sober and knew that something was wrong. John had managed to get himself up, I can't remember if he ended up passing out at my place or if he just went back to his. But I woke up the next day just feeling extra foggy. I wasn't hungover, but my head was pounding, just hurt. I sucked it up and went to work. I found out later that day that I had gotten a concussion and should not have gone to sleep. I was extremely lucky. Honestly, I could go on and on about all the stupid and most often funny drunken things that I did. But there's one night in particular that has been my favorite. We were at the last bar of the night, and our group tended to draw in a few extra people. We were a fun group, and people wanted to be a part of that. We were drinking and mingling within the group and chatting with all the other drunken patrons there. And there was a small group of women who kind of attached themselves to our group. We decided that night that we wanted to go to IHOP, which was open 24 hours, and drunken IHOP is kind of delicious. So we invited the group with us, and they agreed. Now, despite all of the depression, the anger, the hatred, the self-loathing, I've always been a social person. I'm a walking contradiction. What can I say? If someone kicks up a conversation with me, I'm going to stick with it. So during our time at that last bar, when this group attached themselves to ours, one of the women had struck up some conversations with me. I know I talked about Sarah. I always talked about her. And I was always proud to tell the whole world that I was married. But to me, we were just having platonic and innocent conversations. When we decided to go to IHOP, the woman and I continued our conversations. And the walk to IHOP, it wasn't too far. It was just enough walking time to get a little fresh air in our systems and to not give up on the walk because we were too drunk to continue. As we were talking, though, I suddenly heard my name just getting shouted at me. So I turned around, and John had his arms out and was asking me where I was going. I suddenly realized that the woman had been leading me not only ahead of the group, but away from the group. She had distracted me with the conversation, and I looked at her just feeling genuinely confused, and I told her, nope. I walked away, and I remember her saying, just, what the fuck? And I laughed and reminded her I was married. Her friends left our group. We went to IHOP, we ate, and we finished the night. I'm not proud of a lot in my past, but I am proud of myself that night. Granted, I wish I would have noticed what the woman was doing earlier, but I was proud of myself that night, and I'm still proud of myself because even as fucked up and naive as I was, I stayed true to Sarah. I don't think I ever told Sarah about that night. I didn't tell her about a lot of those nights because she just didn't like hearing about them. I think it was difficult for her to hear about how much I would consume. It wasn't until many, many years after those days that Sarah told me that she hated all the nights that I went out because she was scared that I would make some absolutely horrible decision or I would never make it back home. I do remember there was a day where we were in a fight over me planning on going out. And Sarah kept telling me that she just really didn't want me to go, and I just could not concede. That ended up being one of those nights where I don't remember the night. I just remember waking up the next day at home and wondering how the hell I got there. And our fight, it just continued right where we had left off. My party days come up a lot. There's lots of fun stories from those days, and I typically don't mind sharing them. I just typically don't share the whole truth about them. And as far as I know, the friends that were a part of our giant drinking group never knew or suspected anything. When my mental health took a massive dip after Sarah and I got married, I reverted right back to the days of building up walls and creating a character that I could hide behind. It's it's painful to say, but only the first few times that we all went out or partied at John's place were just about enjoying the night. My party days were primarily about dependency on numbing or on the numbing effect of alcohol. It was the only thing that seemed to give me relief from my worsening mental health. Eventually, though, thoughts of suicide came back. And suicidal thoughts mixed with alcohol, it's a dangerous thing. I could tell that Sarah and I had more space between us than we had ever had before. We argued a lot, and I blamed myself for almost every single one of them, which just added fuel to the self hate and it added more bricks to those walls that I was building. The worse I felt, the more I detached. And the more I detached, the more I drank. I had known that I was in bad shape for a while, but it didn't really hit me until one morning after I woke up. And during those days, I just wasn't sleeping. I get maybe a few hours and then I would just go to work. And when I went to work, I was typically hungover or I was still very drunk from the night before. But I would rarely get a full night's sleep. And the nights that I did actually sleep were predicated with a beer or two. So I woke up one day, I grabbed the empty beer can that was on my nightstand, and I threw it away. And I was triggered by the sound of that can hitting the several other empty cans and bottles that were in the trash. It hit me that I had not been able to just go to bed without drinking for a long time. Even on the nights that I didn't go out partying, I was still drinking. And that realization hurt. There's so many people who, when they realize that they are at a low point, they rise to the challenge. They start making difficult but necessary changes to get back on track, to pull themselves up. You constantly hear stories about people completely changing their lives for the better after understanding their lows. I was not one of these people. I told myself that I was worthless, and I hated absolutely everything about myself. And I wanted to die. But those memories of my attempts were there to remind me that I couldn't even do that right, which just helped push me further down my own spiral. And then I remember having a thought, an idea, and it was this idea that I aimed for pretty much every night that I went out partying, whether it was bar hopping or drinking at John's. I would just drink myself to death. I mentioned earlier how I just kept increasing the amount of alcohol that I would consume. And I was doing that because I figured the more that I drank, the higher the chances of it killing me were. I told myself that if I died while getting fucked up, at least I would be numb. And when I made that choice, I didn't care about any timelines. I put my trust in the alcohol that it would do the job. And I didn't know. And I didn't know or care when. The last summer that we really partied or bar hopped, I ended up getting alcohol poisoning 3 times. I have never felt physically worse, and I was sick for days. But I felt like the alcohol was working on my request to take me out. So I just didn't mind too much. I hated being sick, and I was frustrated that I was still around after the 3rd time. But I figured the alcohol was just finding out my body's absolute limit. Everyone in the group, they were getting tired though. Everyone was ready to put a cap on those bar hopping days. I mean, we had made our mark. We all had stories to last us a lifetime because of those nights. So as a group, we collectively decided to end those nights. We decided to go out for one last hurrah and then see where life would take us afterwards. And I think everyone was excited for it. I know they were all definitely ready for it. I told myself that if there was ever a time for me to pass away because of drinking, it would be that night. I've never told anyone this. But when we as a group picked our last night, I aimed to die that night. I started pre-gaming pretty early. A few beers and a 750 milliliter bottle of Captain Morgan were how I did it. I remember Sarah just being very hesitant and obviously against me going out that night. The only reason she was letting me go was because she knew that it was the last time. But I remember she was not too thrilled, especially when I was pre-gaming, and especially when John came over to pre-game with me. I mean, we only lived about 20 minutes away from the downtown area if traffic was heavy. Sarah drove us there, and on the way, John and I finished a bottle of rum. When she stopped the car and we got out, we couldn't even get out of the car without stumbling. Sarah would tell me later that she had told herself that she should have just put us back in the car and taken us right back home. We said our goodbyes, though, and I told her that I loved her for what I figured would be the last time. So we met the group at the first bar and immediately started doing our shots. It was pretty much a typical night for us, with the exception that since it was our last night, everyone wanted to go out with a bang. So everyone was drinking heavier than usual, which provided me the best cover. The more they drank, the less they would notice the amount that I was drinking. I remember bits and pieces from that night. I remember sneaking off from the group under the guise of like going to the bathroom and actually going and doing more shots. I remember getting onto someone's case because they were trying to stir up trouble with our group, and I was not about to have that. We never had trouble, and our perfect record wasn't about to be ruined. Don't worry. The irony of me not wanting our trouble-free record to be broken, it doesn't go past me. By the time we made it to the Stone House for the very last drink, there were only a few of us left standing. And most everyone else had either been refused entry because they were too drunk, or they had wandered off at some point. My friend Ryan and I, we were allowed into the bar. We sat down, and I remember Ryan telling me that since it was our last night, he really wanted to have a whiskey with me. Whether it was a shot or a drink, he didn't care. He ended up ordering us 7 and 7s. That was the hardest drink that I had, that I've ever drunk. It instantly triggered my memories from my youth when I used to sneak pulls of whiskey from my dad's bottle, and it triggered the memory of that first shot at the dinner. It took me forever to drink it, One, I mean, my body was at its limit, and I could tell that one of two things would happen after I finished the drink. I was either going to black out and puke everything up, or that was going to be the last drink that I would ever have. Oddly enough, though, I couldn't finish the drink. I tried, but in the end, I'm almost positive that Ryan ended up drinking it for me. I don't remember leaving the bar. I don't remember the rest of the night. I know that I woke up in John's apartment the next day. I was laying in the living room and I saw John come out of his bedroom. We both looked at each other with just complete confusion because we had no clue how we ended up there. I checked my phone and I had several missed calls, texts, and a few angry voicemails from Sarah. All of them were wondering where the fuck I was. The walk from John's apartment to mine, it was less than 5 minutes. But every step I took from John's place to mine, it just felt like an eternity. I was still drunk, very, very foggy, very confused, and very pissed off. My plan to drink myself to death had failed. And I knew that with the bar hopping being completed, the rest of the partying would eventually follow suit as well. Once that happened, I wouldn't be able to hide my dependency anymore. To say that Sarah was furious when I saw her, that would be a great understatement. See, I knew she hit a new level of anger with me because we didn't actually fight. I remember her saying something along the lines of like, "Where the fuck have you been?" And then, "I hope you enjoyed it because you aren't doing that shit ever again." And then we just didn't really speak for the rest of the day. I don't think we ever actually talked about that night. The partying, it slowed way down after that. And we stayed true to our decision to not bar hop anymore. We still partied at John's place, but it went from a few nights a week to once a week. I was still pretty dependent on the alcohol, but I had felt betrayed by it because I was still alive. And my way of keeping my dependency on it hidden was to drink after Sarah had gone to bed. Sometimes dependency on substance abuse, it just really highlights stupidity. We stopped partying altogether with our married friends because we had a bit of a falling out with them. And Sarah was pretty determined to get me away from the party mentality. The couple of times that she joined me to a party at John's or a party at any of our other friends' places, I'm pretty sure it was solely just to keep tabs on me. She was there to monitor when it was time to cut me off and drag me home. Those couple of times that she joined me, I didn't get that drunk and I made it home safely. I was still drinking regularly, but the amount that I was drinking had drastically been cut. I was still very dependent on it, though, and I hated feeling like I was being forced to be weaned from it. Some would say that I wasn't just dependent on the booze, that I was actually addicted to it. I may have had an addiction to it, but I tend to lean heavier into the dependency side just because of how things have gone for me in future years. Had it been full blown addiction, I would not be where I am now. Being dependent or addicted to substance abuse, it has a reoccurring tendency to highlight stupidity. That stupidity is typically exposed through selfishness and fear, and mine was on full display. So I worked harder at building my walls. Many, many years later, after all of this and what's to come, my mom and I were talking one day, and I had never really talked about my drinking with her because I knew that it's a sensitive subject. There is a history of alcoholism in past generations of our family. So when my mom and I talked a bit about my party days, I was informed of a few things. One, I never hid my dependency very well. They all knew what I was doing, and I was triggering memories and feelings that frightened them. Two, my partying had hit a few moments where my family were genuinely afraid for my safety and felt that there could be a day when they would receive a certain kind of phone call. And three, they all went into prayer overdrive for me to not only be safe, but to get away from the partying. Hearing about the prayer about the praying, it didn't really do anything for me. But hearing that I put my family through that kind of deep, gut wrenching fear, that was tough to hear. We don't really talk or mention those days anymore, but every now and again, it'll come up, and my mom will say one comment every time: I'm so glad those days are behind you. I always smile, and I always reassure her that they are. Over the years, and the very few times Sarah and I have ever talked about the past, Sarah has told me that I did, in fact, tell her a few times that I had suicidal thoughts. I know I had told her about the attempts when I was young and that I struggled with it, but I genuinely don't remember ever bringing it up to her after we got married. I know for a fact, though, that I never told her that I had planned on killing myself with the drinking. In hindsight, and after my conversation with my mom that one time, I'd be hesitantly curious if anyone else had caught on to what I was doing with the drinking. Because I do not believe that I hit it as well as I thought I did. It didn't take long after I found hard rock and metal music that I started using the songs to speak for me. I spent years playing songs for family and friends, just not just to show them what I was into, but to also say all the things that I desperately needed to say but couldn't. When Sarah and I were dating, we played music for each other all the time. We had a few songs that we claimed were ours, and I remember showing them to her and just flat out telling her that they reminded me of her and us together. We had three that just stood above them all. We had Angel by Aerosmith. That was the first main one that I played for her. And I constantly told Sarah that she had not only changed my life, but had truly saved it. My words always come back to haunt me. And sadly, after I had fallen deeper into my depression after we were married, I couldn't listen to that song anymore. It just made me feel like I had not only betrayed Sarah, but I had betrayed love. How could I tell someone that they had saved my life and that they had made every day mean something beautiful and then contemplate suicide? The song just hurt. We also had a song by the band Soil. It was a song called Redefine, and the song just summed up so much of how I viewed Sarah. She had come into my life during a very rough time, and her impact was instantaneous. And that song basically told the early part of our story. But every couple has that one song. That song that just completely encapsulates a relationship. We had ours too. I had heard it first while watching a late night talk show, and the musician performed the song, and I instantly connected to it. Sarah had to hear it, and I had hoped that she would connect to it the same way. Lucky for me, she did, and pretty much right out the gate, Collide by Howie Day became our song. With the help of music, and especially concerts, I was able to find peace at times. There were a couple of years when I had the opportunity to go to several concerts, and the majority of those concerts, I was in the mosh pits. First of all, live shows are quite possibly some of the most cathartic and liberating experiences I believe everyone needs to have. There is not much like them, at least that I have experienced. During those troubled years when I was headbanging and screaming to the music, I felt the foundations of my walls shake. For those few years, I felt like I didn't have to hide anything. I could scream the darker lyrics along with the vocalists as a way of speaking my truths, and I didn't feel any shame about it. And then I would jump into the mosh pit. All of the aggression, all of the frustrations towards myself and life in general would ease up. People who have never been to a hard rock or especially a metal show normally don't get it. But every time that I've told someone who shies away from that genre of music, they shake their heads at me and they call me insane. But mosh pits are healthy. They aren't about beating each other up. They aren't just about pushing each other around. Mosh pits give a space for those who need an absolute break. There is something healing in the movement mixed with the music. When the song ends and the pit ends, people are smiling. People look like they just did a difficult workout, but their demeanor is different. And by the time the concert ends, the people leaving the metal show look peaceful. You can tell when you see a crowd leaving a metal show that people were freed and healed from whatever aspect of their lives that was beating them down. Concerts are important. I knew it back then, and I preach about it now. I give a lot of credit to music and concerts for being vital variables for keeping me around. I have no shame to say that when I go see Godsmack, Shinedown, Lamb of God, Mudvayne, Suicide Silence, Motionless and White, whoever, I can feel every part of me that is predicated in fear and self-hate shake and crumble. It is the closest thing to divinity that I come to. And there have been a few times where the feeling of those chains, those walls breaking, is overwhelming. And I can't stop the tears from running down my face. I have left shows where on the drive, all I could do was drive in silence because it was such an intense experience for me. Music is where I put my faith. Concerts are my church. And I will always strongly encourage anyone and everyone to go to as many as you can and just let the experience speak to you. I did the mosh pits for a total of just around a decade, from high school into my 20s. And after I had started listening to and after I got to see them live, I began feeling really drawn to the Wall of Death at Lamb of God shows. It was one of the most intimidating things to me, but I felt pulled towards it. I always knew that eventually I wouldn't be able to jump in the pits. A body can only take so much, and the amount of abuse that I put my body through would eventually catch up to me. I decided pretty early on that the last mosh pit I would do needed to be the Wall of Death at Lamb of God. I wouldn't stop jumping in the pits until after I did that one. And the stars aligned or whatever, because Lamb of God announced a show in Denver with another group that I really enjoyed. And one of my closest friends agreed to come with me, and my cousin, who had opened my eyes to all of this kind of music, was also going to come. I was stoked because I got to share an experience with some of the most meaningful people in my life. This wasn't just a concert for me. As soon as my cousin let me know that he was, in fact, going to be at the concert, I decided I was going to do the Wall of Death. The openers played, we headbanged, I screamed my lungs out. It was fantastic. I have this tendency to completely forget my surroundings when I go to a concert. My focus is entirely on the music and letting it move me as it sees fit. From an outside perspective, I just headbang with furious abandon and I sing, growl, and scream at the top of my lungs. Internally, I'm raising my flags. I'm letting out my war cry. And I am bringing the fight for my life to my inner demons. Lamb of God hit that stage, and I instantly went into my head-banging frenzy. And then as their set was coming to an end, I made my way towards the area of the floor where the wall would be. The band announced that they had one song left, and the crowd took it from there. If you've never heard of or seen the Wall of Death, let me break it down to you real quick. The crowd splits in half in the middle of the floor, and it creates a large empty space between the two sides. This pit relies heavily on anticipation and adrenaline. The band teases the release for a little bit and then gives the crowd the cue. When the cue comes, the two sides sprint into each other, creating just an incredible burst of chaos. So the crowd split, and I found myself on the right side if you're facing the stage. I remember the vocalist making a joke about the audience already knowing what was coming and what to do. Now, from what I had seen previously from the band's live shows, was that the Wall of Death was always done towards the end of their song, Black Label. But not that night. The song started its intro, and the feeling of anticipation was thick on the floor. It was nerve-wracking. And then the cue came, and the two sides just rushed into each other. For a second, it felt like the wall had failed. When we collided, I felt the side that I was on had kind of collapsed onto the other side. But then I found myself going backwards and in the air. That pit went on for the entirety of the song, never once slowing down. At some point during it, I hyperextended my knee, but my adrenaline was so high that I didn't notice it at first. The concert came to an end, and all of us that were in that monster of a mosh pit just came out laughing and smiling, high-fiving. There were hugs. Like, it was incredible. I found my friend and my cousin, and I was limping badly. My knee was it was hurting like I hadn't felt before, but I didn't care. I felt alive. To this day, I haven't had that kind of experience. It's one that I cherish and will never forget. And it was the experience that really opened me up to the kind of mentality towards concerts being spiritual and divine. Now, even though I don't jump in the mosh pits anymore, I feel that same kind of release and adrenaline, but it's not physical. It's all internal and emotional. Music and concerts are important. I owe a lot to the genres and the bands that have helped keep my feet on the ground and to keep fighting. Sarah had given me the go-ahead to get a ticket to see Lamb of God. They were playing with Children of Bodom and In Flames. It was late in the afternoon when I sat down at the computer and I went onto the website to purchase my ticket. I was in our office, which was at the end of the hallway, and I found my ticket, and as I hit the complete purchase button and our card was ran, Sarah came out of the bathroom while holding a white stick and told me that I was going to be a dad. It is difficult to describe the feeling that I had when she told me. Words just don't seem to give it justice. I was excited though, and I hugged and I kissed Sarah, asking if she was sure, and she assured me that she was. We were overjoyed. I woke up the next day for work and was just silent. We decided to hold off on telling everyone right away until after we knew for sure from the doctor that Sarah was pregnant. It also gave me some time to process what all this meant. I didn't talk to anyone during my shift at work. The most responses that I gave were quick little grunts or head nods. I didn't engage in like any conversations, and I just kept to myself the whole day. I had too much in my mind all at the same time. I focused heavily on the aspects of parenthood that I felt was expected of me. Not just the being a dad part, but I focused on the pressure that I felt where my child would be the positive catalyst of change in my life. Everything would turn around for the better. I would stop partying. I would be emotionally healed and never have to deal with depression again. Not to mention suicidal thoughts. Every day would be a new challenge, but I would be expected to rise to the occasion and conquer any and all challenges that came my way, no matter what the toll would be taken on me. My life, if my life were a movie, this would be the montage of getting on track. Growing up, I did have dreams and aspirations for my future. Like most children, I changed my mind a handful of times about what I wanted to be when I grew up. But it didn't take long before I settled on being a storyteller, primarily an actor. I wanted to make movies. It was always the ultimate goal, going to Hollywood and making a name for myself. Acting was always at the forefront, but it eventually shared that spot with directing and writing. I've always felt that since I have spent so much energy and so much time bottling everything up for so long, that storytelling is a way to drown out some of the noise. And since I use movies and music to connect to the world around me, obviously, I would want to be a part of the production on those. When Sarah and I got married, I put it all on hold. Sarah had her dreams too, and her dreams were more attainable at the time. I always figured that I had time to get back to mine. Before I realized what had happened, I had gotten caught up in the drunken stupor and severe depression, and my dreams got pushed further away. I had put them on a shelf for a later time so that Sarah could attain her goals and we could get a little grounded before going after mine. But it simply never happened. Now, I was going to be a dad. And as I processed what I could and what I imagined it was going to take to be, in the very least, a decent dad, I came across those dreams of mine. And instead of leaving them on that shelf, I just packed them away. Being a dad was, and it still is, far more important than any dream of being a storyteller. I figured I would write novels. Maybe that would be a quieter and more attainable route for me. But it just never took off because, as much as I love writing, and I have tons of stories written, they aren't the stories that anyone will ever read. The couple of stories that I gave to people to read and to help me edit never got read, or they just told me that it wasn't any good. But writing these stories with no audience isn't fulfilling. And they never fully replace the original dreams. You would think that I struggled with packing those dreams up and putting them away, but it wasn't as bad as you may think. I had already put them away for Sarah and for us. Packing them away just seemed like a more permanent version of that. But I was doing it for my future child. I wanted to be around for my kid. I wanted to be present. Plus, I told myself that people gave up on their dreams every day. I would just be another one, and no one would be the wiser. Sarah knew that I was processing. I think she still wishes I would have at least talked to her more during that day and the previous after she had told me. Shortly after we embraced and celebrated the pregnancy together, I went silent. I basically didn't talk for over 24 hours. Luckily, Sarah knew that I was processing and just needed the space to do so. She told me that some of my coworkers had actually texted her asking if I was okay and that she had to tell everyone that I was fine. I just had a lot on my mind. Sarah's pregnancy was difficult. She was pretty sick pretty much the entire time. And to this day, I've never eaten so much freaking Burger King in my life. It was what she craved a lot. That and cereal. And my favorite random moment, snow. Yeah, I had to go out on our porch one night with a cup and just scoop up a bunch of snow after a storm because it just sounded good to my pregnant wife. But it was also difficult for me because I constantly felt like I was going to fail. And the further into the pregnancy we got, the more I felt like I was going to completely fuck everything up. I was afraid, and I hated myself for it. And I had too much fear and pride in me to reach out and ask for support or words of wisdom and encouragement. The partying slowed way down, but I still drank quite often just to give myself reprieve from my thoughts and those fears. Granted, it eventually stopped working, and as much as I wanted to increase my intake again, I couldn't because we just didn't have the amount of booze around the place anymore like we used to. I couldn't go out as often because I needed to be home with Sarah. And the further into the pregnancy we went, the more important it was for me to be present, sober, and ready for any emergency. There were two moments during the pregnancy that really floored me. They shook my world like I had never experienced before, and they are moments that I just won't forget. And not just because it involved my child, but because they were moments of pure joy. The first time hearing the heartbeat was unreal. If you've never experienced it before, I don't know what to tell you because there are no words to describe just how profound that feeling is. We only listened to it for a short time, but I honestly could have listened to nothing else except that heartbeat on a loop. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. If you've experienced that moment before, you get what I mean when I say that trying to describe it is just, it's impossible. I can tell you that one of the things I felt was an intense love. I already loved the little being when Sarah told me she was pregnant, but hearing that heartbeat evolved that love just intensely. It took a couple of tries to find out the sex of the baby. It was as if the baby knew what we were trying and kept turning around away from the ultrasound camera just at the right time so that we couldn't tell. But when we found out that we were having a daughter, there was that initial excitement. Sarah and I didn't care if we were having a boy or a girl. It didn't matter. We were having a child, and that was enough. The details would come later, and we would accommodate. For me, really the first thing that went through my head when the doctor lady told us that we were having a girl was that my daughter would never have daddy issues. I would be there for her through it all. She would know me, and she would know that I am always there for her. Buying all of the baby stuff and changing our office room into the nursery was a blast for me. I loved it. We didn't do the cliche colors. Instead, we decorated that room in nature colors. We had greens, browns, and animals. There were times when I would sit in that room before our daughter was born, and I would just focus on the fact that soon there would be a new life in that room. It scared the shit out of me. But in those moments of clarity, my fears and my doubts meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was that soon my daughter would be in the world, and I loved her. I had told myself that I needed to be present, sober, and ready for when it came time for our daughter to be born. She was a little behind her due date, and Sarah and I were given a list of things to try to get the delivery process going. By the time our due date came around, Sarah was done with being pregnant. She was completely over being exhausted, uncomfortable, and all of the other aspects of pregnancy. She was ready for our kid to get out. As I said before, I didn't really sleep during those years. And once we got to and past the due date, I really didn't sleep at all. One night, Sarah looked at me in the middle of the night and informed me that it was time. I had the bag packed and ready. All we had to do was get to the car and then get to the hospital. My adrenaline kicked in immediately, and by the time we walked through the entrance of the hospital, I had been awake for a little over 24 hours. We got admitted, and a doctor and a nurse came in to check on us. Sarah was in an exuberant amount of discomfort when the doctor checked her dilation. This dude was a big guy. He was older, and his hands were the size of a giant. And his voice was deep and sounded more intimidating than you would imagine the voice of God being. He did his checks and then informed us that we may have headed to the hospital too early. He would wait a little bit before checking again, but there was a chance that they would have to send us back home until Sarah was further along. The doctor left, and Sarah looked at me, informing me that we weren't going anywhere. I agreed. He checked Sarah again one more time and informed us that we could stay and that his shift was ending, so a new doctor was going to take over and handle the delivery. He left, and we waited for a little bit before a younger, smaller doctor came into the room and introduced himself to us. I called the family and a few of our closest friends and informed them that we were at the hospital and that the baby was on the way. Sarah's dad was the first to arrive at the hospital, and he just barged right into the room. There was a bit where he tried to overstep his boundaries by taking control of the moment. We were already under high stress, and his intrusion was a bit much for Sarah to handle. I've always understood where his emotions were in that moment. How could I not? Sarah was not only his firstborn, but his first daughter. However, Sarah was my wife, and she was about to give birth to our child. I didn't appreciate being pushed aside as if I didn't have any say in the matter. I also really didn't appreciate how he was talking down to Sarah and adding so much unnecessary stress to the moment with all of his questions and his frantic need to be in control. It was as though he had completely ignored the fact that Sarah was the one that had endured 9 months of pregnancy. We got him out of the room, but it didn't take long for him to come in again just to check on Sarah. We had to get a little firm with him and get him out. And after he left, I had to inform the nurse that we didn't want anyone in the room until after the baby was born, which she enforced quite nicely. My adrenaline was pretty high, but it was starting to run on fumes. I was exhausted, and I could feel my body just wanting to shut down, but there wasn't a chance in hell that I was going to let it do that. Sarah knew that I was drained and that my exhaustion was pretty bad. So she ended up suggesting that we watch a movie, figuring I would at least be able to close my eyes during it and get a little bit of rest. She was right. We put on Igor, an animated movie about Dr. Frankenstein's helper. And I don't remember it because my body did shut down, at least for a little bit. I think out of the 90 minutes of Igor, I was out for maybe half of it. But I've never counted that as actual rest because I was very alert for when Sarah might need something, which she did. Her discomfort was getting worse and worse. Sarah had wanted and planned to hold off from getting the epidural until just before giving birth because she didn't want to experience the pain. The doctor checked on us a couple more times, informing us that we were getting really close to that time. Sarah's discomfort got the better of her, and she requested the epidural. Sarah, like so many others, absolutely hates needles. They triggered intense stress and anxiety in her. If you've ever seen the needle that's used for the epidural, you know that thing is a goddamn beast. When the anesthesiologist arrived with the epidural, I tried very hard to keep Sarah's attention away from seeing that thing. She sat up and turned to face me, and to turn her back to the doctor as he wheeled the cart with the needle on it into the room. I kept telling her to focus on me and to keep holding my hands. I thought I was doing a good job of not letting her know when the needle was out. But I must have made a facial expression because Sarah knew the second that I saw that needle. She gripped my hands tighter than she ever had before. Everyone in the room kept telling her to breathe and that it was going to be okay. She was given the shot, and although the whole thing took like no time at all to do, It felt like time had slowed down and then sped right back up again once the needle was put away. Sarah laid back down, and we prepared for the final lap of the pregnancy. Shortly after the shot, Sarah started complaining about her lower back. She was uncomfortable and once again in pain. It confused us because the epidural is known for completely numbing everything. She put up with it for a bit, but then told the nurse about it, and the nurse informed the doctor, and so he had to come in to check on Sarah. Everyone was a little confused why she was experiencing lower back pain and discomfort again so quickly after the epidural. He took his seat and checked on Sarah. Now, I don't remember his exact words, but they were in line with, "Oh, your baby is already on the way." We looked at him with a good mixture of confusion and shock, and he informed us that our daughter was apparently on her own timetable and was already starting to come out. 6 pushes. I watched my daughter be born, and it was so unreal. I cut the umbilical cord, way spongier than they tell you, and the nurses took our daughter to wipe her off real quick. I noticed the blood on the mat in front of the doctor, and I looked him dead in the eyes. "Anything happens to my wife, and I will kill you." The doctor smiled at me and reassured me that this was normal, that Sarah was going to be fine. Sore, but fine. Our daughter was brought to us, and we finally got to meet our little girl. And the best moment of my life happened right then. We were both in shock and awe of our daughter. She was actually here. And during the pregnancy, I spoke to our daughter through Sarah's belly. People had claimed that it was important for parents to speak to the baby during the pregnancy. It was awkward, but I did it, and the payoff was astounding. I leaned down to get a little closer to our daughter, and I said hello. And she looked at me with those fresh eyes and locked eyes with me. One dream of mine had officially come true. I was a father. It's my most cherished memory and moment of my life. My newborn daughter making eye contact with me was affirmation that of all the things that I had fucked up, at least I did one thing right. She was the most astounding and beautiful thing I had ever seen. After a bit of Sarah and I just being in the moment with our newborn, we decided to let the family in and meet the newest addition. It was so cool watching our families admire and quietly celebrate our daughter. If that moment had been a movie, I would have edited it to be silent. Close-ups on, over the shoulder, wide shots of all the smiles, the tears, and the love that was overflowing in that room. We were taken to our recovery room where I learned how to change our daughter's diaper and how to tend to Sarah if she needed it while the nurses were out. After we all got settled, I got to order my special meal from the hospital. And they prepared a pretty tasty meal for the new fathers, to enjoy while the moms and the babies rested. I got steak and lobster tail with a baked potato. Now, this is pretty much where it goes blank for me. There are photos of some of our friends and family visiting us in the recovery room. I'm interacting with them and holding my daughter. I remember holding her and just admiring the beauty that fit inside my forearm. People often say one thing when it comes to new parents. They tend to say, everything is about to change. I hate that phrase, especially when it comes to parenthood. It's the greatest understatement of our existence. I had heard it thousands of times before my daughter came into the world, and as I sat there and held her, change seemed like the greatest blessing one could hope for. Our nurse came into the room at one point and checked on Sarah and our baby. When she was satisfied that they were good, she came over to me. I was sitting on like this weird little couch chair thing. And the nurse informed me that it was time for me to get some rest. I told her that I was fine, I didn't need it. I needed to be awake in case Sarah or the baby needed something. I had been awake for over 34 hours at this point. The nurse looked me square in the eye and she told me that I could either lay down and get some rest on my own, or she would be more than willing to help me get some sleep. She had everything covered and I didn't need to worry. I conceded, and I don't even remember the nurse leaving. Apparently, we had more visitors while I slept, but I have no memory of it. I woke up during the night and just watched Sarah and our baby sleep. Everything in me felt as though I was finally able or going to have a true fighting chance against all of my demons. I felt inspired and ready to take on the world and reclaim my life, all in the names of my daughter and Sarah. I fell back asleep full of hope for the first time in a long time. I wish this were the point in my life that I could say, I got my life back on track. I wish I could say that I got cleaned up. I got my shit together, tapped into a hidden strength that had been lying dormant. I wish I could have been smart enough to hold on to that feeling that I had that night. But I let it slip because my fears and dependency, it got the better of me. My self-loathing and feelings of being a failure took their shots, and they landed. Make no mistake, my failures and my faults during my daughter's early years were in no way because of her. All of the mistakes that I made came barreling down because I never opened up to anyone. And the older Jovi got, the more I was forced to sober up. And being sober was what I feared the most because I wouldn't have the alcohol to hide behind when the hate that I held for myself was just a little too much to manage. It didn't take long for me to start putting an unreasonable amount of pressure on myself as a father. I fell right back into a mindset that I hadn't been in for a very, very long time. I convinced myself that I had to replicate my brother. He was a dad and was doing an incredible job at it. Every time that I was told about what was new with my brother and his family, it was always in high praise. And as awesome as it is to hear that your brother is excelling at being the family man, I mainly heard the voice in my head telling myself everything that I was fucking up. I couldn't replicate my brother's success as a father or as a husband. I couldn't even compete with him. Every time I saw my parents, especially if Sarah and our daughter were around, I would try to overcompensate just how fucked up I was by trying to overly assure my folks that everything was great. I did the same thing with Sarah's side of the family, and I did the same thing with all of our friends. I had come full circle to the early days of the decline of my mental health. Only now I was up in the ante, and that kind of gambling really never works out. So the first year of being a parent put me through the ringer. It beat me down like I had never felt before. The truth is, I wasn't proud to be a dad because I felt so unfit and unworthy of the title. I was so fucked up with all of my inner demons and my dying mental health that I simply wouldn't let myself be okay with not having the answers and admitting that I needed help. I slept less than I previously had because I simply couldn't sleep. I was always in my head. And Jovi, she didn't sleep well for that first year either. She was up in the middle of the night through most of the night, most of the week. I never woke Sarah up though. I would go and take care of our child because I felt like Sarah needed the rest. She needed a reprieve from the stress of a fussy baby and a husband who was on the verge of killing himself the majority of the time. I got I got good at changing diapers in the dark and at fast speeds. Many nights were spent rocking my daughter in my arms as I paced her room and the rest of the apartment. For a short time, the driving around trick, it worked, but when that stopped working, I found out that if I just carried her in her car seat, she would fall asleep. But that gets painfully exhausting very quickly. I was always frustrated that it would take forever for her to fall asleep, and it would be years before I could understand why. She couldn't sleep because I couldn't sleep. Children are insanely receptive, and everything that I was struggling with just radiated off of me, and she caught on to it. She couldn't sleep because there was so much unrest and stress weighing me down that it affected her. Every time I couldn't get her to fall back asleep, I chalked it up for another tally in my never ending list of failures. I started to grow irrational and at one point started to convince myself that the best thing for everybody, our families, friends, Sarah, Jovi, would be for me to just vanish and die alone. I felt like I couldn't do anything right. And the more that I told myself that, the more convincing I was. I remember it boiled over one day when Jovi just wouldn't stop crying. And Sarah and I were fighting while trying to calm the baby down. Nothing was working. I told Sarah that I was done. I was sorry, but I just couldn't do all of it anymore. It was an outburst of emotions that I was trying to keep bottled up when stress peaks, and it always peaks, things just come out. My comments stirred the fires of our fight just a bit more. And I sat on the couch and Sarah took our baby into the bedroom. And the apartment went silent after a while. And I replayed the whole thing in my head just over and over and over again. I wanted to drink. I wanted the alcohol to make good on our deal, to take me away. I was ashamed and defeated. Sarah and we talked after that, and all I could say was that I didn't mean it and that I was sorry. I was in over my head and I didn't know what to do. We made amends and continued with the day. We had we had some great moments as well though. There were moments in that first year that were incredible and were able to just outweigh the negativity. Sarah and I worked a lot, but there were plenty of times where it was just the baby and I while we waited for Sarah to get off work. We took several walks. Well, I walked while she snuggled in her stroller. I found a trick that worked to help Jovi take her naps. It drove Sarah nuts, but I still think it's hilarious and awesome. Jovi would fall asleep to metal music. It was the double kick of the bass drum that did it, but I like to give the genre as a whole the credit. Watching her grow just in that first year blew my mind. It went by so fast, and there were so many things that she achieved that I was honored and still am that I got to be there to see the majority of it. At the at the end of spring in 2010, I was fired from my job. It was a real shitty setup that the management did, but it was okay because that place was a death trap. And I had never been more miserable at a job than when I was there. It sucked the life out of you when you would just pull into the parking lot. I loathed that place more than I did myself. I remember telling Sarah, and she was happy to hear it. A little worried because we suddenly found ourselves operating on one income, but happy that I was out of that place. The timing was pretty great because we had moved in with Sarah's mom shortly before that. Sarah had told me that she wanted us to save money and having the extra help with Jovi would be beneficial for us both. The bad part was that the country was still trying to recover from the economic disaster of '08 and '09, and trying to find a job became impossible. I was denied my unemployment because my previous employer had submitted that I had chosen my unemployment. I would apply to all kinds of places while Jovi napped, and every response I got back, whether it was an email or a phone call, was that they didn't have anything for me at that time. I was even told by a few places that they felt that I was overqualified to work for them. More tally marks on that mental list that I had. I could sense that Sarah and I were becoming more distant. I knew that I had put up my walls. I had separated myself from talking about really anything internal with her. We would fight and I would retreat to the basement. More tally marks. One win, though, was during my time as a stay-at-home dad. I got to see Jovi take her first steps, and I got to hear her first words. We went on tons of walks. Sarah's mom had a massive and very comfy recliner that also rocked. Jovi's sleeping habits were still pretty terrible, and I still wouldn't wake Sarah up most of the time. I would get Jovi, take her down to the living room, and put on a movie turned all the way down, and I'd have the subtitles on. I would rock her back to sleep, and then I would recline and finish the movie while Jovi slept on my chest. There were a couple of times that Sarah would come down confused, and I would tell her that we just couldn't sleep. Excuse me. My favorite moment during that time, though, was one day I was feeling very beaten. I had just received a phone call from Pizza Hut telling me that I was overqualified for a management position there and that they didn't have anything for me. I told them that I was qualified and that I would take any job they might have, not just the management one. The guy apologized to me and hung up. I knew Sarah was going to be pissed to hear that I lost yet another job. Jovi was sitting in the living room playing with all this random stuff that kids tend to play with. One of which was a large wooden spoon. I sat on the floor and I tried to play with her, but I couldn't bring myself to do so. Instead, I just sat against the couch and watched her. And my mind started listing all the ways that I was failing her and Sarah. But those thoughts were silenced by what I was watching. I watched my daughter play with a wooden spoon, and she looked as happy as anyone could. That spoon was the greatest treasure one could find, and it was hers. In the quiet of my brain, I had a new thought. If my baby can find so much joy in something so simple, why can't I? And the rest of that day was great. We sat and played and watched Mickey Mouse House Club for hours. But once again, I couldn't I couldn't maintain my hold on the positivity. The rest of that year was a daily repeat of the previous one. There were a couple of moments here and there that gave a break to the routine of my life, but that year had something waiting for me that I was never prepared for. Even though my instinct had told me long before it happened that it was coming. During that year, I had reconnected with an old friend from high school. Her husband was a musician, and I figured that since I wasn't going to be pursuing a future in cinema, maybe I could have some fun being in a band. Plus, it would give me the chance to vent out some of the things that were in my head. We instantly hit it off, and it didn't take long for us to start putting some songs together. We worked pretty diligently on our material, and one of our other friends started learning bass so that he could be a part of our little group. Our guitarist knew a drummer, and soon enough, we had a full band. I didn't want to jump out of the gate with songs of absolute anger and aggression. I knew that our guitarist and our drummer were from the religious side of things and tended to talk about how angry music didn't do a lot for them. And they really didn't think songs needed a lot of cursing. So I had to toe the line just a little bit with them. I had some anger sprinkled into our songs, and I had a few curse words tossed into the lyrics every now and again. But I walked that line very well, and our songs were pretty cool. Our bassist brother in law, he owned a business that happened to just have this empty meeting slash storage building that he let us use as our practice and writing space. I loved going there. And I found some peace and mental quiet when I went to our practices. It helped that I was able to start venting some of the shit that was just parading around in my mind. I knew that I wanted the music to be a little heavier, a little more aggressive, but we were at a fairly good start. I told myself that if anything, we could always evolve into something heavier as time went on. I imagined our sound somewhat following the footsteps of Pantera, just without the drugs. After months of writing and practicing, we decided to bring a few friends and our wives to our practice space, and we planned to perform for them. We wanted to see if they would enjoy our stuff, and we also wanted to show our wives what we had been working on. I was feeling a spark of life again when I was with the band, and I wanted to show Sarah that. I wanted her to see a piece of me that was positive, and maybe if she could see a glimmer of the version of me that she had known prior to the drinking, maybe she could feel better about our future. We finished performing and we did like this little Q&A with everyone about the songs and about the band. Our friends enjoyed it and gave us some great encouragement. I remember driving home that night, and Sarah told me that she enjoyed what we had so far and that she was glad to see me smiling again. I was elated. The only person who I really cared about enjoying what I was working on was her, and she gave that to me. So, my daughter and I were talking about dream jobs. She's always asking me about my dream jobs and giving me what if scenarios. She knows that creative arts and storytelling are where my passions and my dreams reside. I've told her about how long I've wanted to be an actor, director, and writer for most of my life. The only time I haven't wanted to be a storyteller was for a short time as like a 5 or 6 year old when I thought that I wanted to be a cop, but that was never a dream. That was like a passing thought. My daughter has come to me several times telling myself, her mom, her grandparents, her stepdad, of all the different jobs and careers that she has wanted to be when she grows up. Like most children, these career choices have changed several times over the years, but in the last couple of years, she has really homed in on a couple and has stuck to them for the most part. It's such a surge of joy as a parent when you get to not only hear about your child's dream job, but to be invited to join in on their passions. I love hearing her when she talks about her love for anime. I love it when she really gets rolling with how the animation has helped inspire her to learn more about culture and how it influences the anime. I may not be a big fan of the stuff, but she knows that I will be there rooting for and cheering her on as she continues that passion. On top of having a passion for anime and everything involved with it, she's also kind of developed a passion for having her own business, primarily a quaint little coffee shop and diner. When she told me about the coffee shop, it set us off on a giant conversation about how great local coffee shops are, and her vision for what that place would be like was so inspiring to hear. She has a very specific vision for it, and honestly, not just because she's my daughter and I'm a little biased, but it sounds like the perfect kind of spot to bring people together. It was such a great conversation, and I always feel so privileged to get to hear about it. But then all of this led to my interesting moment. We watched a movie about chasing your dreams, and it sparked the conversation again. But this time, the conversation felt different. We talked about the difficulty that can come with chasing your dreams and some of the sacrifices that get made along the way. I'm always super honest with her, and this wasn't going to be an exception. Our conversation started and then turned to me explaining to her how sometimes the world and life become so caught up in the idea of working to live and living to work. And I found myself full of passion and dreams and not being able to actually chase them because I came to a point in life where I had to sacrifice the chase. And to be honest, the dreams. I have to work. I have to have a steady paycheck because I have massive responsibilities that are more important. The conversation went quiet for what felt like an eternity to me, and then I told her, I am rooting for you to chase your dreams and make them real. Don't sacrifice them, kiddo. The conversation ended there, and all I could think about after that was how my daughter had just realized that I had pretty much given up the chase. I think I just got caught up with saying that I always had time to accomplish my dreams, but time slipped away, and now I find myself stuck in a routine of the day job because I have to have a day job. At some point, I sacrificed the dream. It brought up a lot of thoughts and hindsight. I've been so good at starting stories, helping others work towards their goals, keep persevering for their dreams, but I can never follow through with my own shit. Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's the world around me. It could be so many things, but it felt like a blow to me as a parent. I've always wanted to do something that would make my daughter proud of me, proud to call me her dad. And the understanding of sacrificing the dream really feels like I just lost a lot of credibility. It sucks. Some would say, it's not too late. What better time to start than now? She's proud of you and loves you, etc. But none of that really does it for me. And I don't think it would make any parent in my shoes feel better. I'm at a point in life where all I have left is to tell my daughter, be better than me. Don't be like me. How is that supposed to inspire? How is that imparting wisdom? Now I find myself in a spot where, as a father, I think the reigning champion of fear for me is that my daughter follows my footsteps and steps away from her dreams. Being a parent can be such a pain. We continued to work and refine the songs that we had. The goal was to have those things memorized to the point where they were basically muscle memory. And we continued to write more songs. My lyrics got a little darker. They got a little angrier by the song. And I remember our guitarist telling me that he didn't think we needed super angry music. And if we were going to have some angry songs, then we needed to have some positive ones as well. I wanted to smack him. Instead, I compromised and I focused on writing a positive song. I don't remember what I came up with because it wasn't genuine. And it was full of spite. I got some lyrics written after a couple of days, and when I showed it to him, I do remember saying, "Look, positive lyrics, just like you wanted." We never completed that song, but we did end up getting a handful more written, and we did feel like we were starting to really tap into a creative rhythm. We felt good about what we were coming up with. December 21st, 2010. I will never forget this date. My brother and his family had come to Colorado to visit for Christmas. And I remember being so overjoyed that I was going to get to spend some time with him. I needed my brother. He's kind of like my dad, where when I'm around him, I just feel good. Sarah and I had come to a point where we basically operated like roommates who just happened to sleep in the same bed and had a child. But we had definitely lost a big piece of our connection. It was killing me. I hated being distanced from her. I hated where we were. So I had decided at the start of the month that it was well past time for me to just open up to her. I was going to tell her everything. I wasn't going to make any excuses. I was just going to spill my guts and do the one thing that I should have done from the very start of all of it. I was going to ask for help. My goal was to let it all out at the end of the year. We could start the new year fresh and start off by getting mentally healthy and reclaiming our relationship. I was I was awake super early on the morning of the 21st. I rehearsed it in my head over and over again, and I imagined what Sarah's reaction was going to be. I was scared, but I knew that it was necessary, and that if we had any hope left, it would rely on me opening up. I was sitting at the dining room table, which faced the rest of the house, and I could see the living room, the stairs that led to the third floor, and the stairs that led to the basement. I knew Sarah would be up soon enough because we were all supposed to spend the day together. I wanted to get our conversation in before we met up with my family. And if it went on long and we missed a day with them, I knew that my brother would understand and would have told me that I made the right decision. So Sarah came downstairs and sat on the couch. And I let the quiet of the morning just kind of be for a short bit. But I couldn't postpone the conversation anymore, and I blurted out, "Can we talk?" Sarah jumped on it. She agreed, and I started. "I hate where we are. It's not good. Do you still love me?" "Of course. I'm still in love with you. I mean, that's never changed." Sarah shook her head no. "Do you still love me?" I asked, fearing that I already knew the answer. "Not anymore. I didn't think that you loved me anymore, so I just kind of fell out of love." I shut down. Every last drop of dwindling hope that I had left in me was gone. Everything that I was, everything that I had believed we could get back, died when Sarah spoke those words. The only thing that I could think of was that I had to get out of there. I stopped talking and I walked away to go upstairs, but I collapsed on the middle landing. I couldn't cry. I couldn't really do anything. I just sat in my mental KO. I wanted to get the car keys and just drive away. But I stopped myself because my instincts told me that if I got behind the wheel of a car, not only would I die, but I may inadvertently take someone else with me. I was in no shape to be driving. So I pulled my phone out of my pocket and I called my brother. As soon as he answered, I told him that I needed him to come and get me. And he knew instantly that something bad had happened. I told him that Sarah had just told me she no longer loved me and that I needed to get out of the house. 20 minutes later, I got the call that they were outside. I left without saying a word to Sarah. My brother was with his wife and their daughter, and the drive back to my parents' house was awkward. And my sister-in-law asked me what happened. So I gave her the short version that Sarah and I had been too distant for a while, and that I had wanted to try to mend it. Instead, Sarah told me that she didn't love me anymore. We all knew what was coming next, And the worst part of knowing it was that I was going to have to tell my dad. My dad adored Sarah. He held her up in such a high regard, and he covets marriage. He holds love and commitment in the highest of regards. He is a firm believer that love and marriage are sacred and that they aren't easy for a reason. You are supposed to work on them constantly. And now I was going to have to tell him that my marriage was ending and that love, at least on Sarah's side, was dead and gone. We got to my parents' place, and my mom asked me what was going on, and I told her the even shorter version than what I had told my sister-in-law. My mom hugged me and gave me that motherly love that she was going to try and make things better for me. And then she reminded me that I was going to have to tell my dad when he got home from work. I took a seat at their dining room table and just vanished in my mind. I don't remember anything from that moment until my dad walked in the house. He got himself cleaned up after a day's hard work, and then my mom informed him that I had something I needed to tell him. I got maybe 3 words in before I broke down crying because telling my dad that my marriage had failed felt like I let him down. How could he be proud of a son who let love die? How could he be proud of a son who had decided to drink his problems away instead of working on them? My dad hugged me, but he didn't really say anything. He just nodded his head, and we ended up just staying in that day. And I slipped into the abyss of my mind once again, and I stayed there for the remainder of the day. One day, after both of our families were informed that our marriage was ending, Sarah's mom called me upstairs. I went up, not knowing what she was going to say to me. I was defeated, and I felt as though I had completely let her down. I got upstairs, and she was standing in her room, and on her bed, there were a few gifts that were wrapped and waiting. She told me that they were mine and that she still wanted to give them to me, despite everything that had happened. It was only a few small items, but her gesture meant so much to me. I hugged her, and she told me that she was sorry for how things had turned out. I apologized for everything, and I thanked her for all that she had done. And less than a week later, I was moved out. During that time of separation, I stayed in the basement of the house because we only had one bed, and obviously Sarah and I weren't going to be sharing it anymore. I had to set up a cot in the basement to sleep on. I tried sleeping on the purple love seat that we had, but it was just too small for me to be comfortable in. The cot was just as uncomfortable, but I was able to stretch out my legs. I didn't sleep much. I mean, the truth be told, I didn't sleep at all. Those nights were spent in tears and nightmares. Every night I would find myself staring into the darkness and basically Watching my mistakes throughout my marriage just play out in front of me like a home movie. Every drink I poured down my throat, every fight that we ever had, and every moment I took for granted just seemed to take on a new life in my mind. And the darkness of that basement just gave those memories a stage to perform for me. Alongside those memories, I would try to force my mind to imagine a scenario where I could save our marriage. I basically inserted Sarah and I into every dramatic romantic movie where the guy completely opens up, owning every mistake and proudly confessing their love and saving the relationship. I wanted so badly to be the hero of our marriage. And I told myself that we could do it. And when we got our shit together, we would be a force to be reckoned with. I would love Sarah more fiercely than I had ever loved her before. She would see the improved version of me that didn't drink, got help for my mental health, and got back to just enjoying life. And instead, Sarah told me that she wanted a divorce. We had just grown too far apart. We were done. There was no more Sarah and Dustin, and there never would be again. I moved back in with my parents shortly after the new year, and my mind just went into survival mode. Survival mode, it's not exactly healthy because all it focuses on is that you at least get some food, and my disguises just all morphed, transformed into this one Dustintron. I told everyone that I was fine and that it was going to be okay. I summed it up to people as shit happens. I forced every smile, every piece of happiness that I displayed was false. I lied to absolutely everyone about how I was. I had to. I had to lie as often and as convincingly as possible because eventually I had to lie enough to believe those lies myself. If I could convince the world around me, I could convince myself. Here's something that doesn't get talked about. And I think it stems from a generational mentality that then has been purposefully dismissed in today's cultural climate of, all men, especially straight and Caucasian, are evil. But here's some facts about us men. And I will admit that there are always going to be exceptions, but this is true for the greater number of guys than it isn't. When men invest into a relationship, it isn't done so lightly. It doesn't just mean that we will tell our partners that we love them just because that's what you do in a relationship. When we tell our partners that we love them, are in love with them, It is an admission to vulnerability. When we fall in love, we give our all. We go all in. All of our love, vulnerabilities, and most importantly, our trust. We bet it all, knowing that the future will always hold rocky roads. But we are willingly giving every part of us to the ones we are in a relationship with. It's why when a meaningful relationship is ended by our partners, we take it so terrible. We lose it all and we have no idea how we are supposed to go about getting any of it back. Some shut down, build their inner fortresses, and decide that never again will they allow it to happen. They tend to turn into the players. Some cut themselves off from the world for a long time and just work on themselves. They do the work to better themselves, and they tend to be a little guarded. But when they're ready, they start venturing out again. These are the successful ones. They tend to find lasting love. They are the ones who typically say something like, I found true love when I stopped looking for it. And some turn to old habits and spend every moment that they are awake contemplating if anything is worth it and thinking about just taking themselves out, because a life without love is meaningless. Guess which group I fell in? From January to May, I was an emotional wreck. I didn't drink because I was back with my folks, and I didn't want them to see me that way. I didn't drink because I was desperate for Sarah to see that I was capable of making positive changes. But every time I would see her, and I saw her smiling about not being with me anymore, I would resent her more. And oddly enough, as hurt as I was and as heartbroken as I was, I couldn't bring myself to hate her. I wanted to. I wanted to hate her more than I had ever hated anything or anyone, but I just couldn't do it. And that pissed me off. We opted out of using lawyers. Neither of us could afford it. But it took some time for Sarah to convince me that there was no chance for her and me to reconcile romantically. I didn't want to believe it, but it was true. She kept telling me that someday we would be able to look back on our past and be able to laugh at some of it and be able to talk about it. I remember going to her place to fill out the divorce papers. Every new page we filled out, the worse I felt and the happier she looked. My emotions were in desperation mode. And the more that Sarah refused to consider giving us another chance, the more I felt like a waste of existence. And in a spurt of emotional outburst, I threw something onto the floor. I can't remember what it was. I think it had change or something in it because it made a mess. Sarah instantly reacted by telling me to get the fuck out. She shouted that if I were going to behave like that, then she would finish the paperwork herself and I could just text her any info that she would need. She made it clear that she felt unsafe around me. And just when I thought I couldn't feel any lower, knowing that I made the person I loved feel unsafe let me know there was a lower feeling. We argued for a bit, and I apologized for my outburst, and eventually I settled down enough to finish filling out the paperwork. I drove home, 25-ish minute drive, just berating myself for being such a worthless idiot. We've always told people that our split was amicable, but that's not entirely true. It didn't become amicable until I completely gave up trying to fight for us. Sarah had made up her mind, and there was no changing it. She resented me too much for those 4 years of putting drinking ahead of her, and she blamed me for the divorce, for the distance that had grown between us. We both fucked everything up. But she was right. Once I plummeted into drinking, I spiraled, and I never talked to her about it. I hated that she was right, but I couldn't deny it. I don't blame myself for the complete downfall of our relationship, but I have held myself accountable for being the one to tip the first domino. We were scheduled with a mediator to see if we even needed one. By the time we showed up for the meeting, though, Sarah and I had already split everything. By the time that meeting happened, I had thrown in the towel. I had no choice. Sarah was already seeing someone new, and her mind had been made up, and the process was just too far along to go back. And then the mediator gave us our court date, 4 months away. I remember both of us being a little shocked and bummed because we figured it would be pretty quick. The mediator told us that the state did that on purpose to give the parties time to emotionally cool off and reconsider the divorce, since there is a high percentage of divorces that happen simply because the couple was just having an emotional outburst. They did it in all cases. We just wanted it to be over with. I'd be lying if I said that I didn't have a stirring inside of me to bring the fight for the relationship back. But I shut that stirring down. I just didn't have the emotional strength for it. And during all of this, and after we told all of our friends and families that we were done, I spent a lot of time defending Sarah. She was the love of my life and the mother of my child. Did she make extremely poor decisions that were factors in our end? Yup. But I made poor decisions of my own, and I had been the one to knock that first domino down. I hated hearing people talk negatively about her. Reminding them that if anyone would have the platform to hate her or talk bad about her from, it would be me. It was exhausting defending her. And what really sucked was that during the whole thing, I lost friends who picked sides and had picked Sarah's side. To this day, I don't know what Sarah told people. I do know it was bad. Two of my closest friends even vanished on me. One of the problems with people's perceptions about others is that when substance abuse is involved, we tend to assume that any and all bad things said are true. Since Sarah had been sober for the majority of our relationship and I was a drunken emotional wreck for the majority, I was the easy target for everyone. I reached out to those friends and we ended up having an intense conversation about the whole thing. I wasn't aiming to persuade them or anything. I just needed someone to hear my side. Where did you go? It was the only question that I needed them to answer. They both knew what I meant, and there was just a quiet moment that followed. I let Jake and Christy know that I hated that they had picked a side. I hated that they had done so without talking to me, without hearing my side of things. I remember Christy telling me that it was something that just seemed to happen after they had talked to Sarah. They both understood my disappointment, though, and so they gave me the floor to speak. We were at that Starbucks for a good amount of time. And as I spoke, Jake remained quiet but engaged, and Christy was visibly getting upset. I finished saying what I needed to say, and Christy burst out, "Fuck Sarah." I couldn't help but laugh, but then I did what I had already been doing and what I continued to do. I defended Sarah. Christy started to tell me the things that Sarah was saying about me, but I stopped her before she could get too far. I didn't need to hear the details. I already knew that it was nothing good. The point of the conversation had been two things: to give my perspective and to mend our friendship. It wasn't supposed to be an ex bashing. I genuinely believe that our conversation at Starbucks that night began laying the foundation of what our friendship is to this day. After we said our goodbyes and we gave our hugs, I heard from Christy. She told me that she knew that I didn't need her to, or nor did I want her to, but she couldn't help but send Sarah an angry text. "God damn it, Christy," I responded. But I would be lying if I said that it didn't feel a little bit good having someone defend you and stand up for you. My band was still there, and I had some new songs. It was awkward walking into our practice space for the first time after Sarah and I split. The guys basically tiptoed around me with what they could say or ask. I just told them that I didn't want to talk about any of it. I just wanted to make some music. So we didn't talk about it. We just worked on the songs. And shortly after that, our drummer just up and quit on us. He said that he had fun with us, but he wanted to concentrate on the musical side of things at his church, and the kind of music we were making just wasn't his thing. I didn't care. He was just another person to bail on me in that growing list. We decided to record our songs, minus a drummer, just to have them. We could add drums in later during editing, and during a break in our recording, I showed the guys some of the new lyrics that I had. They were some of my angriest yet. But I had a lot to get out, and this was how I was going to do it. My guitarist handed them back to me. looked me straight in the eye and told me no. He told me that I wasn't allowed to write material that was that angry because that wasn't the intention of the band. I just took my lyrics back and I shut down. We tried to continue recording, but my heart just wasn't in it. I had just been told that I wasn't allowed to express what I needed to in a medium that is specifically made for expression. We were a hard rock band. I was going through a failed marriage, trying not to succumb to full-blown drinking again, and constantly had suicide on the mind. And I wasn't allowed to let some of the angst out. We called it a night, and that was the last time that we worked on music for the band. It was a long 4 months. But our court date finally arrived, and for whatever stupid fucking reason, Sarah and we decided to drive together to the hearing. Walking into that building, I instantly felt as though I was walking to my execution. There was a heavy silence that resided in that place, and none of it was positive. We found our courtroom, but the doors were closed, and there was a sign on it with a list of cases, ours being one of them. We didn't know if we had to wait or if we were allowed to go in. So we took a seat on the chairs that were just outside the door. I would look over at Sarah, seeing the smile on her face and envying her. I envied her ability to dismiss everything we had been through, the good and the bad. I envied her ability to discard the vows that we had made and the love that she had claimed she had for me once. I envied all of it. And it hurt knowing that I meant so little to her, that she was able to move on so quickly. She had reason to smile that day, and all I felt that I had been left for dead. I got up and I went to the bathroom, and I could feel the tears starting to form, and I didn't want Sarah to see me cry. I felt like she wouldn't have cared, but it would be just another notch on the Dustin is pathetic board in her eyes. While in the bathroom, I tried to control my breathing and force the tears away. I told myself that I had to accept that this was happening. I had to accept this failure so that I could move on. This was happening, and there was nothing that could change the fact. And then I told myself, treat it like a death. This is the part where you are informed of the loss, and you can start to actually grieve. I composed myself and left the bathroom. Sarah was standing and telling me that we could go into the courtroom. There were a bunch of couples in there, and we took our seats in one of the pews. The judge came in and informed us how the proceedings were going to go. He was going to start with the messier cases and work his way down. A lot of the messy cases were quick check-ins with the mediators and the lawyers. There were a couple of no-shows, and then the courtroom was empty, except for Sarah, myself, and one other couple. The judge told us that he had saved us for last because we had chosen to do this process without lawyers, which showed that we are more amicable and open to collaborating with one another, especially since there were children involved. He gave us a quick lecture about how he never wanted to see our names on any docket in his court. We needed to focus on putting the children first, and that any dispute or personal feelings about one another had no business taking priority. He basically told us all to get over ourselves. And then he continued with the process. It was pretty quick. And I felt like an idiot a couple of times because I stumbled on my words and responses. I mixed up Jovi's birthday and saw the judge's disappointment. But our case ended when Sarah and I signed the paperwork. I watched the judge make his mark, close the folder, and then he excused us. The metaphor of closing a chapter in your life has always been quite a common one. I had used it several times before the divorce. I still use it in aspects of my life now. And everyone I know has used it at least a dozen times. But it is a very weird thing to physically watch someone sign the end of the biggest chapter of your life and literally close it with a quick signature. I was officially reduced to a statistic. We left the courthouse. Sarah was just all smiles, and I put on my fake smile. It was lunchtime, and I suggested that we get lunch together. And I remember Sarah being a little hesitant, but after a little nudging, she agreed. And we went and had sandwiches together. I couldn't help but judge us a little bit, but in this whole mess, I wanted at least one good moment to hold on to with Sarah. I wanted one last chance to hear her laugh, to have a normal conversation with her. Lunch was weird, but it wasn't bad. We finished lunch. We went back to her place where my vehicle was, and we said goodbye. Obviously, it wouldn't be the last time that we saw each other. We shared custody of our daughter, who wasn't even 2 years old yet. So we would see each other all the time. But when I drove away that day, there was a strange emptiness that accompanied me. I was officially alone for the first time in almost 8 years. When I had packed my stuff and moved back to my childhood home, I made a specific box just for the marriage stuff. It's full of the items that I kept from our wedding day and a bunch of stuff afterwards. It's all positive memories and mementos, but it's sealed. Sarah kept a bunch of stuff as well, the idea being that when our daughter was old enough, we would give her all these items so that she would know that there had been a time when her parents were happy together. It's been well over 13 years since I sealed that box, and I still haven't opened it. I don't think I ever will. The only time it's going to be opened is when I hand it to Jovi and she opens it. As soon as the divorce was in motion, a trend of support happened to me. During the whole process of the end of the relationship, I had held onto hope. I had held out hope that love would conquer all. I needed it to be true. I knew that love had lost, and I just couldn't bring myself to admit it. And then the comments of support came out from those around me. I never thought she was the one for you. Someone else will come along. God has something better planned for you. Those comments were said from places of care, but they were the absolute last thing I wanted to hear. It was impossible for me to hold on to the hope of love conquering when I had everyone telling me that the love which I had believed in was false. Every time someone made these kinds of comments to me, I couldn't help but feel increasingly betrayed by love. You know, in the earlier days of our relationship, when we were focused on each other, we were silly together and proud of it. If there was something cute and odd that we could associate with ourselves, we embraced it. And Sarah came up to me one day, all smiles and a cheesy giggle. Did you know that if you just mouth the word alligator, it looks like you are saying, I love you? It does. Watch. And she mouthed the word, and it kind of looked like I love you. I mouthed it with her. And soon, alligator became a thing for us. We would be with friends, caught up in conversations with the group, standing close to or standing apart. But we would look at each other and just mouth the word. It was a silly thing. But it was our silly thing.